They say the first mask was not worn to protect the living, but to hide the shame of surviving. Welcome, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight, we walk through the smoke-filled streets of a dying world, a world where the air itself could kill, and mercy was measured in distance. The age of plague had begun, and death wore many faces, but none more terrifying than the beaked mask of the doctor. The year was 1348. Europe bled from an invisible wound. In cities like Venice and Florence, death moved faster than light, unseen, unstoppable. The air tasted of ash. Bells rang without pause. The living stopped counting the dead because numbers had lost their meaning. And yet, among the chaos, one man refused to flee. His name was Matteo Ferrante, a physician of uncommon curiosity. He did not believe in divine punishment or the wrath of saints. He believed in patterns, in science before it had a name. But even he could not escape the stench of despair that clung to every street, every breath, every prayer whispered into cloth. Matteo walked where no one dared, through alleys lined with corpses, through homes where families sat motionless around empty tables, eyes glassy and still. He wore a simple linen mask soaked in vinegar, but it did nothing to keep the sickness out. He coughed, he burned with fever, and one night he collapsed in the square beside a dead fountain. They found him the next morning, still breathing, though barely. And when he awoke, he found himself surrounded by strangers wearing long black robes and masks shaped like birds. Their faces were blank. Their voices were echoes. "You are not ready to die," one said. "Who are you?" he whispered. "We are what comes after fear," another replied. "We are those who choose to breathe death and call it cure."
They offered him a choice: to rise, to wear the mask, and to serve the dying, or to rest and become one of them. Matteo chose to live, though he would soon regret it. The initiation was not ceremony, but contagion. They led him to a chamber beneath the church, walls lined with bones, air thick with incense and rot. At the center stood a basin filled with blackened herbs, vinegar, and something thicker. They told him to kneel. They filled the beak of his mask with the mixture and sealed it shut. "Breathe," they said. The fumes clawed at his lungs, his vision blurred. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, everything. He saw the streets above, the dying below, and something else, a presence that lived between the two. A figure cloaked in shadow, wearing no mask at all, whispering in a voice that was not human. "Now you are mine." When he awoke, the chamber was empty. The candle had burned to its end. The air was cold, and his mask, his new face, had fused to his skin. Matteo emerged into daylight, changed. His fever was gone. The stench of decay no longer reached him. He could walk through plague houses untouched. The people began to call him Il Dottore Nero, the Black Doctor. To some, he was a savior. To others, an omen. Wherever he walked, silence followed. He dissected bodies by candlelight, recording every swelling, every lesion, every twitch of the dying. He became obsessed with what he called the breath of death, the moment between the last inhale and the stillness after. He believed that in that instant, the disease revealed its true face. But there was something else. In that brief silence, he began to hear voices, not of the dying, but of the dead. They whispered from within the mask. "More," they said. "Learn more." He wrote everything, pages upon pages of symbols no one could read. He claimed the disease was intelligent, that it spoke in patterns of heat and air, and that only the masked could understand its language. Rumors spread that the mask itself was cursed, that the herbs inside were not plants at all, but ground bone and ash, that the beak was designed not to purify the air, but to funnel it, to catch something unseen.
One night, a young apprentice stole the mask while Matteo slept. He placed it upon his face and laughed. "The doctor's secret is nothing but superstition," he said. By dawn, he was dead. His body lay twisted, the mask shattered beside him. Inside the broken beak, where herbs should have been, there was something moving, small, pulsing, alive. Matteo burned his laboratory that same night. The flames turned green, then blue, then black. He walked into the fire wearing his mask, and though the house collapsed into ash, no bones were ever found. The next morning, the city awoke to find hundreds of birds circling the sky, crows, ravens, vultures, moving as one. And in the square where Matteo had once collapsed, someone had drawn a symbol on the cobblestones in soot and blood. A mask, split down the center, one eye dark, one hollow. That symbol would appear again and again, carved into plague carts, painted on morgue doors, etched into the masks of men who called themselves Custodes Umbrae, the keepers of shadow. They said they had inherited Matteo's knowledge, that through the mask he had learned how to listen to death itself, and that he still spoke to them, through the mask, through the air, through every breath taken by those who dare to heal. This was how it began, not as medicine, but as faith, not as healing, but as worship. The birth of the plague doctor's mask was not the story of survival, it was the story of surrender, the first vow to serve something older than life and colder than death. Next time, we descend into the fog-choked canals of Venice, where plague became industry and the mask became law. The story of Venice, the city of smoke, awaits. They said the plague did not reach Venice by ship. They said it climbed out of the water. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight, we walk a city built on salt and secrecy, an empire of fog where masks were not costumes but currency, where smoke hid sins, and where the living learned to speak softly so the dead would not answer. This is Venice, the city of smoke, where the plague doctor's beak was not a superstition but a passport, and where survival itself became an industry. By the time the bells began to toll without resting, Venice already knew how to die beautifully. The city had rehearsed for centuries, funerals that looked like festivals, penitents gliding by candlelight, processions of priests in gold singing through silted air. But there was nothing beautiful about the way the first bodies floated up in the morning, caught against the green steps of the fundamenta like driftwood. The gondoliers cursed softly and rowed backward, crossing themselves with hands that trembled. The signoria, those careful men in careful robes, did what merchants do when threatened. They organized. Orders flew across the lagoon with the confidence of men who believed paper could outpace breath. Quarantine houses were expanded on the Lazaretti Islands. Watchtowers along the inlets were manned day and night. Ledger books swelled with names, captains, crews, widows, orphans, each entry neat as prayer. But disease reads faster than ink. It began with a smell, Venetians would say later. Not rot, not sewage, something thinner, like a wire drawn through the nose, sharp, metallic, unforgettable. Then came the heat that felt like shame, the buboes that rose like secrets, the blackening of the skin that no perfume could plead with or hide. Doors were chalked, then nailed. Visitors learned to knock with gloves. Children learned to be silent, a trick the city had never taught them before.
Out on the water, the Lazaretto Nuovo and the Lazaretto Vecchio filled until their corridors echoed with the soft thunder of coughing. The dead were not buried immediately. There were rituals, there were inventories, there were hands to count, teeth to record, rings to remove for the log. Venice could not stop being a merchant, even when trading with the grave. The masks arrived by crates, leather beaks, glass-eyed goggles, gloves long enough to remember another arm. The first time a child saw a plague doctor step from a skiff, she laughed. The second time, she hid. The third time, she learned to call the figure dottore and to bow. By day, masked physicians moved across the bridges like black commas in a sentence Venice refused to finish. By night, smoke thickened in the alleys, smudge pots burning herbs, ashes drifting across the canals until the city tasted like a pharmacy on fire. The smoke did not cure, but it made people feel less watched by the air. Trust process, said the magistrates. Trust fire, said the priests. Trust us, said the doctors. The city nodded, because what else could it do? In the Campo dei Santi Giovanni e Paolo, a temporary hall rose, all canvas and desperation. Here, the plague doctors trained the new recruits, the eager, the condemned, the men who understood that a mask could elevate a nobody into something nearly divine. They practiced the ritual of dressing. Oil the leather, pack the beak with rosemary, myrrh, juniper, rue, tie the cords until the face vanished, pull on the gloves in the overcoat, tap the cane once upon the ground to learn how sound travels when smell cannot. A man was not a man once masked. He was a function. On the fourth evening of instruction, a Venetian physician named Brother Aurelio arrived, a man with a monk's stoop and a merchant's eyes. He had a habit of speaking to the air, as if negotiating with it. Disease is a market, he told the apprentices. It rises and falls. It creates scarcity and price. We will buy time. We will sell hope. We will make a margin of mercy. They laughed, then fell silent when he did not. He led them to the water's edge. A barge slid from the mist, burdened not with cargo, but with the quiet shape of a city block, doors, windows, household shrines, plucked whole from a parish being dissolved by orders of hygiene. We remove the parts that cannot stop burning. We float them away before the rest ignites. Behind him, a boy raised his hand, cheekbones too sharp for his age, fingers stained with ink. "And the people?" he asked.
"The people," Aurelio replied, "are the smoke." Not all doctors belonged to the same creed. There were the civic physicians, tidy with their tools and their contracts. There were parish healers with hands that smelled of oil and bread. There were barber surgeons merry with razors and crude optimism. And there were the others, the ones who answered no bells, whose earnings were measured in silence, who reported not to the magistrates, but to an address that existed only on the water. They called themselves, among themselves, Custodes Umbrae, the keepers of shadow. They wore the same masks as everyone else, but the glass in their eyes was smoked darker, and their beaks were packed with secrets. The keepers did not chase cure, they chased pattern. They followed the fog where it thickened hardest. They made notes on which churches rang last. They weighed the city by listening to how long echo took to return in empty lanes. They had taken Matteo Ferrante's sigil, the mask divided, one eye dark, one hollow, and stitched it into their collars where the cloth folded like confession. Aurelio was not one of them, not yet, but sometimes at night he found himself on the wrong boat, going the right way. The lazzaretti were cities within the city. The wards were arranged by degree of hope: new arrival, questionable, confirmed, consolation, quiet. The fifth ward had no official name, because naming it would have been an admission that there were places where no priest bothered to learn anyone's face. Between wards ran corridors washed with vinegar, where the floorboards were sanded smooth by careful feet. In some, saints stared from the walls with eyes that had been repainted so many times that they no longer knew where to look. In others, there were no saints at all, only chalk tallies, knots in string, a child's clipped lock of hair pinned above a bed like a bright comma. Aurelio learned the lazzaretti as a child learns a new city, by getting lost in the same place until it remembers him. He learned how to read a body from the doorway, how to touch without touching, how to breathe as shallow of faith as possible. He learned the difference between weeping and the sound people make when the body has forgotten how to breathe, but not how to try. He learned, too, that the city could be greedy with its dead, refusing to yield them easily, that the lagoon wanted everything back, including the names.
One night, wind bullied the smoke toward the city proper, and Venice blurred. From a bridge near the arsenal, Aurelio watched the fog bend around lanterns like cloth. Beside him stood a woman in widow's black, her veil wet with condensation rather than tears. "They say the masks keep the bad air out," she said, coolly conversational. "Do they keep the bad prayers in?" "Sometimes," he answered, unsure whether she was speaking to him or to the water. "My husband was a glassblower in Murano," she continued. "He died with clean hands. That is how I knew it would be quick." In Venice, grief was a trade. It could be shaped, cooled, sold. The island of Murano spat light into a city that increasingly preferred shadows. Glass lenses for the doctor's masks, glass vials for their tinctures, glass amulets for the poor who clung to the old belief that you could trap sickness the way you trap a genie, inside a bottle if only you cork fast enough. The glass houses burned constantly, their chimneys coughing orange into a sky already clotted with smoke. On nights when the wind turned wrong, the city glowed as if lit from under the water. The keepers used Murano for other purposes. In a furnace no ledger ever mentioned, Aurelio witnessed a different craft. A workman in ash-white gloves fed scraps of parchment into the flame. Names written in a neat hand, each curling into letters he recognized only from the margins of death registers. The fire did not consume them fully. The soot collected in a shallow dish of blown glass, fine black dust with a sheen to it like ground pearl. The master stirred it with a metal rod and hummed like a man content with his own heresy. "What is it?" Aurelio asked. "Insurance," the glassman replied, and did not elaborate. Venice was not only smoke, it was water, always water, water as God and judge. The city floated on the very thing that threatened to drown it, and when plague came, the sea was both moat and mirror. The magistrates used boats to move the sick, to move the healthy, to move the line between them. The keepers used boats to move something else entirely: information, fear. A certain boat tied to a certain piling was a signal that the western parishes were safe. Another boat at another hour meant that a patron whose face should never be seen upriver wished to speak. So Aurelio listened. He stood on docks at hours that had no business existing. He learned from fishermen how the fish had stopped biting near the mouths of certain canals. From laundresses how some linen sank as if the river were tired of returning them. From gravediggers how the earth on the islands of the dead still breathed at night, in concert with the tide. He learned from the poor where the plague pretended to be charity, from the rich where charity pretended to be prophylactic. He learned that power, like disease, prefers crowded rooms. There was a hospital near the church of San Lazzaro de Mendicanti, where the air lived in two layers: the breath level of the sick and the taller layer where hope still floated. Beneath the double windows, the plague beds aligned like piano keys. Every other one empty to preserve the illusion of isolation. The doctors in their beaks moved from bed to bed, marking the interval between coughs like conductors. Once, Aurelia counted to see if there was a pattern, to see if death obeyed a rhythm. He found one. He wished he hadn't. "Do you ever think," said the young clerk who followed him with ledgers and sand, "that the masks are not for protection?" "What then?" Aurelia asked, looking over a wrist for the vein that tells the truth faster than the mouth. "That they are a promise to the dying that we will not flinch." "Make your letters smaller," Aurelia said softly. "The page won't survive you."
On the 7th week of the season, when bells rang more than doors, a rumor spread that a gondola had been seen rowing itself. No oar, no man, no current. Just a black boat moving down the Rio della Misericordia with a doctor's mask propped upon the prow like a figurehead. Boys chased it along the fundamenta until it turned, of its own will, into a narrow cut between buildings and vanished. 2 days later, a barge full of herbs caught fire without a spark. 3 doctors swore at once and laughed immediately afterward because it sounded like the only joke death leaves the living. All of this is happening, and still your mouth thinks it can matter. The city tightened its measures. New quarantine, new fires, new paper laws that looked like salvation until you read the 3rd line. Certain districts were sealed from certain hours. The poor learned to move like water, finding ways around walls that had not been built yet. The rich learned to breathe through silk and to pretend it helped. Everyone learned to speak from windows and to lower baskets on ropes with coins that had been boiled. Aurelio watched the city invent distance and call it morality. In the archives of the ducal palace, a room so dry it seemed to conserve breath as well as paper, he flipped a folio and found something he was not meant to see. It was small, a letter folded within a ledger, written in a hand so steady it had to belong to a man who believed entirely in his own right to write. It listed the names of ships detained at the lazaretto, the crates of spice impounded, the families whose sickness allowed their houses to be seized for the common good. At the bottom, a note: "The fog is profitable." He folded the letter back into its hiding place and left it there, because truth behaves poorly in daylight. The keepers approached him finally, not as recruiters, but as men who had decided that a choice already made only needed blessing. They found him where most men avoided being found, on the steps of a church that had stopped ringing, at the hour when bakers' ovens exhale their first breath before dawn. They did not draw their knives. They did not show their marks. They simply stood near enough to make a decision feel like taking a step. "You are already one of us," the tallest said through his glass-eyed beak. "You listen to air as if it speaks."
"It does," Aurelio answered, not bravely, but because he was too tired to pretend it didn't. "And what does it say?" "That it wants a price," he said, "and that we are fools for calling that price a miracle." They took him to the edge of the lagoon where Venice stops pretending to be land. There, water decides whether to love the city or to remind it of their arrangement. The sky was open, low. Across the flat distance, a body lay upon a stretcher, wrapped, masked, tagged. The keepers did not ask him to pray. They asked him to count, pulse, breaths, intervals, and then to stop counting when the numbers ceased to mean. The man on the stretcher shivered twice, then not again. They did not bury him. They placed him in a shallow boat with a black sail the size of a handkerchief. They pushed. The boat drifted a few lengths south, then turned as if considering the city with a last unsentimental affection, and slid toward the Lido. The keepers watched without theater. The water closed. The air resumed. "What was that?" Aurelio asked, because some questions are obliged even when answers are not. "A ledger entry," the tallest replied. "We balance the book." He did not sleep that night. He sat on a bridge and watched smoke walk the water like a man. Behind him, a window opened and closed. Far away, a woman sang herself into readiness for a day she knew would not require beauty. In the morning, he went back to the lazaretti and wrote his name in the book of arrivals and departures, a small act of treason against forgetting. Venice learned quickly which voices could still command. The Doge's proclamations traveled neatly but landed lightly. Parish bells, when they found their courage, moved feet faster than any edict. Plague doctors' canes, tapping doors only they were permitted to open, carried the authority of fear. But the keepers spoke in a language quieter than all of these. They changed where boats tied, and the city obeyed.
At the far edge of things, in a ward no map acknowledged, Aurelio found the room he would later pretend never existed. The air there felt different, thinner, eager. A table held order amid ruin, vials labeled not with humors but with times, a human heart in a glass jar, beating slowly, as if deciding whether effort was still fashionable. A mask pinned open, its beak emptied of herbs, and filled instead with something like ash, only it reflected light. Beside it lay a ledger, and on its page a symbol he knew from whispers, the divided mask, one eye dark, one hollow. He touched the page. He did not mean to. His glove smudged the ink and left a crescent the color of smoke. From the wall, a draft moved, as if the room had sighed. In the margin of the ledger, a hand different from the main script had written a single line. "We do not catch the plague. We host it, briefly, as one hosts an honored guest one means to learn from." He closed the book and turned to find the tallest keeper in the doorway, as if the door had consented to build itself around him only now. "You came," the man said, not quite pleased, not quite disappointed, like a teacher whose student has finally arrived to learn what cannot be taught. Aurelio gestured to the heart in the jar. "What do you call that?" "Practice," the keeper said. "And prayer." "And the city?" "Also practice, also prayer." "I am a doctor," Aurelio murmured, hearing the implausibility of it for the first time since he had begun to wear the mask. "We are supposed to end things." The keeper tilted his head, the lenses in his mask catching the lantern. "You are supposed to know when to stop pretending that ending is possible." Outside, Venice exhaled. The smoke thinned for an hour, then returned. A bell decided not to ring. Far down a canal, a boat knocked twice against a piling, and then once more, as if remembering a code it had not been taught. The lagoon lifted and lowered the city like a tired mother. By season's end, Venice had developed a ritual for everything survival requires. How to hand bread through a window, how to light a candle for a neighbor whose name one never learned, how to sew the beak that moves air farther from the mouth and convince oneself it is safety, how to say domani with enough faith that tomorrow too can be invented. What the city did not create, the keepers refined. They did not wear their masks at home because they did not have homes, only rooms the city borrowed from itself and returned without apology. They did not speak loudly, they spoke exactingly. They did not draft laws, they drafted practices that lasted longer than any proclamation. They did not ask for permission to survive, they survived. And in the narrow hour just before dawn, when bodies rest briefly from dying, and the air is thin with promises freshly minted, Aurelio stood on the Riva degli Scavioni and watched the water move like a thought the city had chosen not to finish. He took off his mask and held it by the straps, as if it might bite. The air on his face felt indecent, intimate, like a hand over a secret. He considered the shape of the beak, the glass of the eyes, the leather that had remembered the sweat of men braver or more foolish than he. He considered that the mask did not only keep breath out, it kept the gaze of the dying from finishing its sentence in him. He understood that power was not a crown or a title. Power was the ability to decide how close to stand. In Venice, power wore a beak. "Welcome back," he whispered to the air, unsure whether he meant himself or the city or something older than both. Behind him, footsteps. The tall keeper again. He held out a small packet. Inside lay a pinch of black dust that shimmered faintly. "What is it?" Aurelio asked. "Insurance," the man said, smiling the way men do when they do not wish to be remembered for the truth they are telling. "You will know when to use it." "How will I know?" "You will be asked to breathe," the keeper said. "The city will ask, and you will answer."
Venice did not end that year. It ended and ended and did not. The smoke lifted and returned. The lazzaretti emptied and filled and emptied again. Lovers kissed from two boats lashed together at the mooring. Babies were born stubbornly into air that wanted to deny them. Painters learned a new palette called ash. Priests learned a new theology called distance. Doctors learned a new oath: do not lie about what you do not control. And the masks multiplied. They hung in rooms like moons. They hid in cupboards like frightened animals. They floated on water in the dark to mark the channels the living still could trust. The beak became the city's second face, its ledger, its apology, its shield. Later, when the fog made a cathedral of the city and the wind organed the alleys into music, children would ask why the doctors looked like birds. Their grandmothers would answer, "So death will not recognize them." But their grandmothers knew better. The masks were not camouflage. They were confession. Venice survived by learning a single, complicated verb: to host. It hosted merchants and saints, rumors and rituals, music and mourning, smoke and masks, plague and power. It hosted the keepers, because no city that loves its reflection ever refuses a guild that can polish its fear into function. And it hosted Aurelio, who stood between ledgers and lungs and learned at last to listen. Next, the mask leaves the water for the firelit rooms of Florence, where skill sharpened into doctrine and mercy turned to method. The House of Needles waits, and it does not open its doors. It opens your skin. They say knowledge is a cure. But in the age of plague, knowledge was poison, distilled, bottled, and sold to those desperate enough to drink it. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we descend into the secret laboratories of the 14th century, where the plague doctor's mask became not just armor, but initiation, a key to forbidden science. In the flicker of candlelight, medicine and magic joined hands, and Europe's first brotherhood of death was born. They called themselves Custodes Umbrae, the keepers of shadow. It began in Florence, a city that smelled of perfume, parchment, and corpses. The Black Death had stripped away faith faster than flesh. Churches overflowed, morgues burst, and men of learning began to whisper what priests dared not say aloud: that God had abandoned them, or worse, that he was studying them. In the back rooms of the Ospedale degli Innocenti, where plague victims were dissected in the name of salvation, 5 men gathered under a single candle. They were physicians, apothecaries, and alchemists. Their robes were black, their faces hidden beneath the long-beaked masks of their trade. Each one had seen too much of death and too little of meaning. They met not to heal, but to understand. The leader was a physician named Aurelio di Rossi, a man who believed disease was not divine punishment, but communication, a language older than prayer. The others called him Il Chimico,
the chemist. He was the first to claim that plague could be transmuted, that the pestilence, if refined, might reveal a substance capable of both killing and curing, depending on who held the formula. He called it vita nigra, the black life. The Brotherhood's pact was written in blood upon vellum torn from a monk's psalter. Its words were simple. We do not flee the plague, we become its students. We do not fear death, we ask it questions. Their experiments began in silence. They harvested the air of plague houses in sealed glass spheres, burned it over silver crucibles, and captured the smoke. They collected blood from victims moments before death, studying how it thickened, how it changed color when touched by heat, salt, or prior. The first discovery came by accident. An apprentice crushed a gallbladder beneath a hot iron, and the fumes made the observers faint. But those who revived within minutes found themselves strangely calm, almost euphoric. Aurelio called it the serenity of contagion.
Soon they began to test themselves. One doctor sliced his arm, rubbed a tincture of infected blood into the wound, and survived without a fever. Another drank a diluted version of the same mixture. He screamed for 3 days before going silent, his body petrified as though carved in wax. They buried him beneath the laboratory floor, not from guilt, but to keep studying what came next. They discovered that heat changed everything. Plague, when burned, lost its stench but not its soul. Mixed with gold dust, it produced a residue that glowed faintly blue. This, said Aurelio, is the breath of death purified. He began to wear a small vial of it around his neck. Others followed. The Brotherhood's masks changed. The beaks grew longer, the lenses darker. Some filled the beaks not with herbs, but with mercury vapor and crushed emeralds. If life enters through air, Aurelio said, then we must breathe knowledge itself. Their rituals became indistinguishable from worship. Before each dissection, they recited an oath not to God, but to the plague. We thank thee, O messenger, who speaks through flesh, who teaches through decay, who delivers truth in fever. The church denounced them as heretics. The city magistrates called them grave robbers of the living. Yet when the next wave of plague came, Florence turned to them in desperation. They were the only men who could walk among the infected without fear. The Custodes Umbrae became a myth wrapped in masks. Some said they had found a cure. Others said they had made themselves immune by feeding on the disease. Their laboratories spread, beneath cathedrals, inside ossuaries, in the catacombs where the air was heavy and pure. They studied rats, fleas, water, air, but their true subject was control. They learned that fear was the most contagious element of all.
The church used sermons. The nobles used soldiers. But the plague doctors used rumor. They whispered that only those who obeyed them would live, and the city obeyed. When they entered a street, windows closed. When they pointed a cane, doors opened. When they raised a vial, crowds fell silent. Aurelio wrote in his journal, "We have learned the first principle of power, that mercy is measured not by the hand that gives, but by the mask that hides it." One night, the Brotherhood performed an experiment they later called the Midnight Trial. They gathered 12 plague victims, all at death's edge, in a sealed cellar beneath the hospital. The air was thick with vinegar and candle smoke. Each doctor inhaled deeply through his beak and watched. Aurelio dripped the black life, that luminous residue, into their mouths, 1 drop each. Within an hour, every candle died. The next morning, when the doors were opened, the bodies were gone. The walls were smeared with soot, as if the flesh had burned without flame. On the floor lay the vials, empty but warm to the touch.
From that day, the brotherhood began to speak of an unseen presence that walked among them. They called it the Patient Eternal, a force that observed their work and rewarded their devotion with silence. Some claimed to see it standing behind Aurelio in candlelight, tall, faceless, wearing a mask without eyes. Others heard it breathing when no one moved. They began to leave one chair empty at their meetings, one bowl untouched, one mask unworn. Aurelio's writings grew strange. He spoke of being chosen by contagion, of hearing voices in the rhythm of dying breaths. The plague is not the enemy, he wrote. It is the mirror. It teaches us the truth that life only pretends to be clean. By the winter of 1350, the Custodes Umbrae had spread across Europe. In every port, in every cathedral city, there were whispers of doctors who never removed their masks, who healed without medicine, who demanded payment not in coin, but in vows.
No one knew where Aurelio vanished. Some say he burned his own laboratory and walked into the smoke. Others say he was taken by the Patient Eternal, and that his mask still breathes somewhere beneath Florence, the herbs inside long turned to ash. But his words endured, passed from doctor to doctor, written in invisible ink upon the inside of their masks. We do not fight the plague, we host it. We wear its face so others may not see their own. That was the true beginning of the plague doctor's power, not in healing, not in science, but in surrender. The mask became a covenant, a confession, a tool of transformation. From this pact of alchemists was born a lineage that would outlive kingdoms, revolutions, and reason itself. A brotherhood that would serve every epidemic not as tragedy, but as opportunity. They say disease begins in the body, but fear begins in the soul. And fear, unlike the plague, never dies. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we cut deeper, beyond flesh and bone, into the chambers of terror itself. This is the chapter where the mask becomes more than protection, it becomes prophecy. For the plague doctors learned something long before the world did. You cannot cure what people worship. And in their trembling, humanity worshipped fear. Florence burned with fever and superstition. Priests preached repentance until their throats cracked. Mothers hung garlic around their children's necks as if the scent of vegetables could bribe the angels. Coffins floated down the Arno, bumping softly against one another, carrying the nameless like dark prayers. And through it all, the doctors walked, faces like birds, wings of black leather glinting in candlelight. The people began to bow to them, not in gratitude, but in dread. They looked upon those long beaks and saw death personified.
It was Aurelio de' Rossi who first recognized the pattern. "The plague spreads through breath," he wrote, "but fear spreads faster, through sight." He recorded how panic traveled through crowds like lightning, how whispers killed as swiftly as fever, how even rumors of sickness emptied markets faster than corpses did. Fear is the truer contagion, he concluded, and perhaps the more useful one. The Custodes Umbrae listened. They had been physicians, but now they became architects of emotion. They began to study fear like an organism, where it lived, how it grew, what fed it. They dissected not the dead, but the dying, listening to their last confessions, words trembling between hope and despair. They noted that when hope was present, death was slow. When hope broke, death came like a tide. They began to ask themselves, what if the power to save lay not in medicine, but in manipulation? The experiments began quietly. A single patient, blindfolded, was told he had been exposed to the plague. He wasn't. Yet by dawn he was feverish, by dusk he was dead. In another trial, a condemned prisoner was told he had been cured. He had not. He lived 4 days longer than expected. Aurelio's notes were meticulous. Belief writes itself upon the flesh. The body obeys imagination faster than it obeys God. He and his circle turned to theater. They orchestrated scenes for the city, faked recoveries, staged processions of doctors carrying healed patients through the streets. They learned that a rumor of salvation cured more men than a dose of vinegar or wine. But their greatest discovery came in the form of silence. In one experiment, a ward of 50 patients was left unvisited for a week. No priests, no doctors, no news of the outside. All 50 died within days. In the next ward, where a single masked doctor simply walked among the sick without speaking, 30 lived. They do not need words, they need witnesses. That was when the Custodes Umbrae began calling themselves anatomists of fear. They believed terror could be weighed, measured, and eventually harnessed. If plague was chaos, fear was its structure, and structures could be built upon.
Soon, the beak itself changed purpose. It was no longer filled with herbs to ward disease. It was filled with scents that evoked emotion. Burnt myrrh to instill awe, lavender to lull the desperate, brimstone to command obedience. Let the air we breathe become scripture, Aurelio said, and let them worship what they cannot understand. The mask had become the sermon. At first, this transformation worked miracles, or seemed to. Entire districts obeyed quarantine without soldiers. Markets reopened, believing themselves blessed by the doctor's presence. Men kissed the hems of black robes. The custodes had turned fear into faith. But faith has appetite. It must be fed. When hope began to wane again, the brotherhood devised spectacles. At dusk, in the Piazza della Signoria, they staged purification rites. Doctors stood upon scaffolds, raising silver censers shaped like skulls, releasing plumes of perfumed smoke into the crowd. The people called it the breath of mercy. They inhaled it willingly. They did not know it contained powdered remnants of plague ash. The fear that followed was exquisite, controlled, predictable, useful. Rumors spread of doctors who could summon the sickness and withdraw it at will. The church sent inquisitors to investigate. The custodes welcomed them, treated them, and buried them quietly. Within months, no one dared accuse them again. By 1351, Florence belonged to them. Not politically, the Medici had not yet risen, but spiritually. The custodes had no need for armies. They had learned that one whisper of contagion could conquer more efficiently than 10,000 soldiers. Their order began to expand. The first disciples were trained not in anatomy, but in observation. They learned how to listen for tremors in the human voice, how to count heartbeats during confession, how to read the pulse of a crowd from a bell tower. They were taught that fear, properly conducted, was the most elegant instrument known to man.
Aurelio, now old and half-blind, wrote his final treatise, Anatomia Timoris, the Anatomy of Fear. He described the body as an instrument tuned by terror. The heart, he wrote, is the drum of dread. The lungs, its bellows. The eyes, its mirrors. Every breath is an offering to what we cannot control. He sealed the manuscript in a jar of oil and buried it beneath his home. It has never been found. When he died, his mask was placed upon the altar of the Custodes' inner sanctum. They say it still breathes faintly, fogging the glass lenses, as though some remnant of its maker refuses to rest.
Under new leadership, the Brotherhood began to travel. They followed plague routes across Europe like pilgrims of pestilence. In Marseille, they experimented on sailors. In Nuremberg, they treated artists driven mad by guilt. In Paris, they performed autopsies on the living, claiming that pain revealed the soul's secret architecture. Wherever they went, they wore the same uniform: black robes, leather gloves, and the long-beaked mask that had by now become an icon. Children drew it in chalk upon doors to ward off evil. Lovers exchanged miniature silver versions as tokens of protection. And yet, none knew that the doctors inside the masks had ceased being healers. They had become philosophers of horror, sculptors of obedience. Because fear, once dissected, could be rebuilt. They discovered how to control the air in a room, how to make it heavy or light, warm or cold, to influence the heart rate of those within. They mixed certain herbs that, when burned, dulled reason and magnified awe. The Custodes had become conductors of unseen symphonies, their music composed from breath and belief. But the more they understood fear, the less they could escape it themselves. The oldest among them began to speak of voices whispering beneath their masks. Some slit their own throats rather than remove them. Others claimed they saw faces in the reflection of their glass lenses, not their own, but those of the patients they had watched die. The mask had begun to look back. And so the Custodes Umbrae learned their final lesson. Fear, once mastered, becomes master. It feeds upon those who feed it. Yet still they continued, because knowledge, like plague, demands its sacrifices.
When the next generation of plagues swept the continent, the Order was ready. They unleashed their fearcraft upon entire cities, predicting riots, manipulating faith, shaping survival. And through it all, they remembered the words carved inside every beak. We wear what they fear, so they may fear what we wear. The mask had become the world's new face. They say the plague doctor's mask was designed to protect, but those who wore it knew better. The mask did not defend, it transformed. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight, we unearth the story of a face that was never human, the long-beaked mask that haunted Europe for centuries, turning healers into omens and medicine into ritual. This is the tale of the Bird of Death, born from reason, baptized in superstition, and perfected by power. The year was 1619. Paris had survived the worst of the plague, but not its memory. The stench of death still lingered in the alleys, soaked into the cobblestones, seeping from the cracks in the cathedrals. Even the wind carried whispers of fever. It was here that Charles de Lorme, physician to the French court, unveiled what he called la costume de la peste, the plague doctor's uniform. Long waxed coat, leather gloves, glass-eyed mask, and that infamous beak. He claimed it was invention. It was not. It was resurrection. The design had come to him in dreams, visions of birds circling over battlefields, their feathers glinting black in the light of burning towns. In the dream, one bird descended and spoke, "If you wish to survive death, wear its face." Delorme awoke fevered but inspired. He sketched the shape, a long beak curved downward, nostrils at the tip, lenses like the eyes of a crow. To the court, he explained the beak was practical, a vessel for herbs and perfumes, a way to cleanse the air. But in his private notes, found only centuries later, he confessed another reason. The form of the bird repels the soul. It keeps the spirit of death from knowing which body is its own.
He was not the first to think so. In older plague legends, death always came as a bird, a raven, a vulture, a stork walking among the dead, choosing which to carry away. In the Black Death's earliest years, peasants told stories of black wings brushing their windows before the fever took hold. The bird walked through walls, they said. It wore a face, like a mask. Delorme had given that ghost flesh. His mask was crafted by a glassmaker from Lyon. Thin as eggshell, tinted green, sealed at the seams with beeswax. The beak measured half a cubit long, filled with a mixture of lavender, cloves, mint, rose petals, camphor, and something else, an unrecorded ingredient the doctor never revealed. Some said it was ambergris. Others said it was dust from a grave. He wore it first before the royal court. The courtiers laughed, the children screamed, and the queen herself fainted. Yet when the next plague struck, the laughter stopped. The bird of death walked again, this time in the streets of Paris. From dawn till dusk, the doctors moved through the crowds like carrion birds picking among corpses. The people no longer saw physicians. They saw fate. Mothers hid their children behind doors. Shopkeepers crossed themselves as the masks passed by. When a plague doctor entered your home, it meant one of two things: salvation or selection. Delorme understood this power. He began to keep records not only of symptoms, but of fear. He documented how men reacted when the bird entered their rooms, how quickly the pulse raced, how eyes widened, how breath shortened. He wrote, "The mask heals more minds than medicine heals bodies. It brings awe, and awe is order." He was right. The mere presence of the mask imposed silence. Quarrels ended, streets cleared, the dying lay still. The bird became a tool of control, a visible reminder that death was organized, catalogued, governed. Other cities followed: Rome, Vienna, Amsterdam. Each crafted its own version of the beak. Each called it protection. But the true design never changed. Every beak curved like a question mark. Every lens reflected the living as if they were already ghosts.
Soon, no one remembered that the bird had been born in Florence's secret brotherhood. The Custodes Umbrae had gone underground, their name erased, their creed preserved. To the common eye, the plague doctors were servants of health. To those who knew the truth, they were inheritors of an older covenant, men who wore the mask not to save, but to balance the scales between fear and order. Whispers began to spread of the Black Parade, a group of masked physicians who traveled from city to city before each outbreak, appearing days before the first corpse. They moved at night, their canes tapping rhythmically on stone, never speaking, never seen twice. People said they came not to heal, but to harvest. In 1630, in the Venetian quarter of Padua, a painter named Tommaso Vecchi claimed to have seen them. He wrote in his diary, "5 doctors walked by, their robes rippling like wings. Behind them trailed a mist that smelled of roses and rot. Where they passed, the lamps went out. By morning, the sickness began." The bird of death had become prophecy incarnate. And yet, in the shadows, there were still those who remembered the original purpose. A small sect of physicians calling themselves the Order of the White Beak claimed that the mask's true power lay in its anonymity. Behind the beak, they said, all men are equal, doctor and sinner, noble and beggar, priest and thief. They believed that the mask stripped away identity, allowing the healer to touch the divine without arrogance. They prayed before donning it. They washed their hands not for cleanliness, but for humility. Their rivals, the keepers of shadow, mocked them. Humility, they said, is the final infection. And so the masks began to differ. Some were polished, silver, immaculate. Others were blackened, rough, scarred by fire. The pure and the corrupt wore the same shape, but their intentions carved unseen divisions into the beak's hollow space. It is said that during the Great Plague of 1665, when London choked on its own smoke and grief, a child followed a doctor wearing a white-beaked mask through the alleys. She thought he was an angel. She begged him to heal her mother. He said nothing, only turned to her. In the reflection of his lenses, she saw herself aged, dying, and gone. When she screamed, he placed a gloved hand on her mouth. "Do not fear," he whispered. "Fear is what kills." Her mother survived. The child never spoke again.
By then, the mask had spread beyond medicine. Artists painted it, soldiers mimicked it, criminals used it to conceal their sins. It became a symbol of plague and penance, of knowledge and nightmare. In taverns, men joked that even death wore a beak now. But at night, when they saw the real doctors walk the streets, they closed their windows tight. Delorme died in his sleep, his final design sketches unfinished. The official cause was heart failure. The unofficial one, suffocation. His servants found his body still wearing the mask. The erms inside turned black, the lenses fogged from the inside. The church declared the plague doctor's uniform a holy vestment of compassion. The people called it the devil's disguise. And so it became both. To this day, no relic of that first mask survives in any museum. But there are those who claim that somewhere, beneath the catacombs of Paris, lies a sealed chamber, the Hall of Beaks, lined with hundreds of masks, each still faintly breathing, their glass eyes watching for the next storm. The bird of death was not just a symbol of disease, it was a mirror. When mankind stared into it, it saw what it truly was, terrified, fragile, and fascinated by its own extinction. And so the beak endured. Even now, when we hide our faces from contagion, we remember it unconsciously. The shape, the distance, the ritual of breath. We are all wearing newer masks, but the fear beneath them has not changed.
They said Florence healed after the plague, but Florence never healed, it evolved. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we descend into the hidden lungs of the Renaissance, where marble palaces masked disease and hospitals became laboratories of faith and fear. In this chapter, we open the doors of the House of Needles, a place that claimed to heal the body but dissected the soul. The year was 1462. The Black Death had retreated like a storm, leaving behind silence and opportunity. Florence had crowned itself anew, city of light, of artists, of thinkers. The streets echoed with the sound of chisels shaping eternity and pens rewriting the world. Yet beneath the marble brilliance, the air still carried a whisper of vinegar and smoke. The doctors knew what the poets denied. The plague had not died, it had only learned to hide. The Ospedale di San Girolamo stood at the city's edge, a cathedral of mercy to the living, and a tomb to those the city wished to forget. The sick entered through its front doors, the condemned left through its back. Its walls were lined with frescoes of saints holding lilies and scales. But behind those walls, down the narrow stone corridors lit only by oil lamps, was another world. They called it Domus Ocularium, the House of Needles. Its founder was Giovanni de Luca, a physician trained not in scripture, but in silence. He had studied the notes of Aurelio de Rossi, the father of the Custodes Umbrae. From Aurelio's lost journals, he rebuilt the Brotherhood's creed, to seek truth through contagion and salvation through suffering. Pain, he wrote, was the scalpel God left unfinished. Giovanni's hospital was unlike any in Europe. Patients were divided not by wealth or class, but by usefulness. He said, the cured teach nothing. The dying were his teachers, the dead his scripture. The upper wards gleamed with polished floors, white sheets, the illusion of hope. But beneath them, in cellars reachable only by torchlight, lay the true purpose of the house. There the doctors of the mask gathered around long wooden tables, not to heal, but to learn how pain moved.
Their needles were thin as hair, their instruments forged by goldsmiths from the same workshops that crafted halos for saints. They experimented not on corpses, but on men who hovered between breath and stillness. They charted the geography of agony, which organs screamed first, which nerves wept longest. Each session began with prayer, though not to God. They prayed to the body itself. "Forgive what we open," they whispered. "Teach what you hide." In the center of the chamber stood a massive clock, its gears ticking with the rhythm of a heart. Every incision was timed, every reaction measured, every scream recorded in ink. The doctors wore their beaked masks even here, though the air was clean. For they had come to believe that the mask sharpened the senses, that through its narrow eye holes they could glimpse the truth behind the body's illusion. Among them was a young apprentice named Matteo Nero, quiet, gifted, haunted. He had joined seeking knowledge. He found revelation. He noticed something his masters did not. The longer they worked, the less the patients bled. "It is as if the body forgets itself," he said one night. Giovanni only smiled. "That is the threshold between man and what follows." Matteo kept his own notes, hidden inside the lining of his robes. He began to see patterns between the screams and silences, between the pulse and the breath. The dying spoke of visions, rooms of light, halls of shadow, figures in masks standing over them long after the doctors had stepped away. Some patients awoke for a moment before death, whispering the same phrase, "He is here." When Matteo asked who, they pointed to the corner of the room, to the place where the air thickened. Rumors spread through the city. Families claimed their loved ones were being examined too closely. Mothers whispered that the doctors could steal pain and bottle it. But the hospital's results silenced all doubts. Florence saw fewer outbreaks, fewer deaths. The Medici themselves donated gold to expand the wards. To the outside world, Giovanni was a saint. To those beneath his roof, he was a conductor of horrors. Then came the experiment of the 100 needles. It began with a single patient, a young woman who had survived the plague but remained fevered, her skin marked by strange black veins. Giovanni called her the Blessed Host. He believed her blood carried both death and its antidote. The doctors gathered in the chamber, masked, trembling with anticipation. One by one they inserted the needles, not to harm, but to map. Every nerve, every vein, every pulse of the body was measured and recorded. The woman did not scream. She smiled. "It doesn't hurt," she whispered. "It feels like remembering." The needles began to hum. The air thickened. The oil lamps dimmed as if starved of breath. When Giovanni touched one of the wires, the sound that followed was like music, a single note drawn from within the human body. The other doctors backed away. The woman opened her eyes, black, unblinking, and said, "Now you see." Then she died. The lamps reignited, the humming stopped, but one needle continued to quiver. Giovanni touched it again, and blood welled not from the woman's skin, but from the metal itself. "She is not gone," he said. "She has changed her instrument." They sealed the body in a glass coffin and buried it beneath the hospital. The needles were melted down and forged into a single mask, its beak longer than any before, its lenses tinted red. Giovanni wore it from that day until his death. Florence began to prosper. Trade returned. Art flourished. Yet under the city, the House of Needles continued its secret work. Apprentices became masters. The experiments grew bolder. They injected tinctures distilled from plague boils into healthy men to teach their blood memory.
Some survived and swore they could hear whispers in the walls. Others, eyes turned black before their hearts stopped. The city called them miracles. The brotherhood called them lessons. When Giovanni died, his mask was hung above the chamber's door, a relic of devotion and warning. Matteo inherited the house, but he feared what it had become. He believed the doctors were no longer learning from death, but serving it. One night he gathered his journals and escaped into the hills. Before leaving, he carved a phrase into the stone wall beside the glass coffin.
To heal is to harm more slowly. Days later, the hospital burned. The flames spread too fast, too evenly. Witnesses claimed the smoke did not rise, it sank. The city mourned. The Medici promised to rebuild, but the foundations were sealed with stone, and none were ever opened again. Centuries later, workers digging beneath Florence for new catacombs struck iron. They found a corridor lined with melted glass and a single door engraved with the symbol of the divided mask, one eye dark, one hollow. Inside, they reported a faint metallic sound, a steady ticking, like a heart still counting the time between breaths. The House of Needles was gone, but its legacy endured. Every syringe, every scalpel, every ritual that mixes pain with hope carries its memory. The doctors of the mask had learned what all healers eventually do, that mercy and cruelty share the same hand, and that every cure leaves a scar in the shape of its maker. They said London's air was too thick for angels to breathe. In the summer of 1665, even God held his breath. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we cross the sea to a city where the plague did not come quietly. It screamed through every alley, knocked on every door, and buried 500,000 souls beneath its soot. This is London, the city that turned death into an economy, and the plague doctor into a merchant of mercy. The city was already dying before the rats arrived. The Thames carried the stench of every sin London had ever confessed, and the bells of St. Paul's tolled until the sound itself felt diseased. The air was heavy with wood smoke, river rot, and something else, something invisible, hungry, patient. When the first black swellings appeared in the parish of St. Giles, the Lord Mayor ordered the streets scrubbed with vinegar and the air perfumed with juniper. It was a polite way of saying, "Hide the bodies." Within weeks, the polite words ended. By midsummer, death wagons rattled through the night, their wheels echoing like heartbeats. Into this horror stepped the masked doctors, the new professionals of plague management. The people called them the collectors of breath. The government paid them per corpse examined, per house sealed, per lie told, because London was a city that believed even the apocalypse should be invoiced.
The most infamous of these men was Dr. Jonathan Hale, chief physician of the King's Commission for Public Health, a commission that existed mostly on parchment. Hale had studied in Padua under the same lineage that traced back to Giovanni di Luca and the House of Needles. He wore the mask differently, sharper, polished, precise. His beak was shorter, packed not with herbs, but with crushed charcoal and mercury. Air, he said, is not the enemy. Ignorance is. But ignorance was profitable. Hale was not alone. Around him gathered a guild of doctors, merchants, and apothecaries, known as the Whispering Hospital. It had no address, no sign, no patients who left twice. It was said to exist beneath London's poorest parish, St. Olave's, where the church crypts ran so deep they touched the bones of the river. The Whispering Hospital was not a hospital at all. It was a network, a living organism of spies, undertakers, surgeons, and priests. Its members communicated through coded death certificates and false quarantine orders. They traded not in medicine, but in information. When a plague house was sealed, the doctors took note of what lay inside: gold, heirlooms, ledgers. When the family perished, the property passed, quote, for public health to the city, and from the city, quietly, to the hospital. Hale called it salvation by acquisition. But there was something else, something darker. Hale's journals, discovered centuries later in a waterlogged chest, describe experiments in sound. He believed that fear and infection were vibrations, that the plague could be transmitted not only through touch or breath, but through voice. Every dying man utters a note, he wrote. Find the frequency, and you will command both disease and obedience. The Whispering Hospital began collecting voices. In the tunnels beneath the city, they recorded the groans of the dying, etched into wax and glass with crude phonographs powered by water wheels. They called it the Orchestra of Mortality. Hale conducted it nightly, playing the moans and gasps backward to test their effects on new patients. Some claimed to feel relief. Others screamed until their lungs collapsed. Then came the experiment of the choir. It began with 12 plague victims locked in a chapel sealed with tar and lead. The doctors stood above in the bell tower, lowering through the roof a silver horn designed to carry sound. They played the recordings of the dying at half speed, letting the echoes roll over the congregation below. For 3 minutes, nothing happened. Then the screaming stopped. The 12 rose to their feet. Their eyes were black, their lips moving in unison, whispering words no one could understand. The doctors fled. When they returned at dawn, the room was empty. On the floor, burned into the wood, was a symbol, a mask split in two, one eye dark, one hollow. After that, Hale changed. He began to hear voices through his mask. They speak to me through the air, he wrote. The city itself is infected with memory. He claimed London's fog carried the residue of every death it had ever witnessed, that breathing it was a kind of prayer. The government grew uneasy. Hale was summoned to the Guildhall to explain the missing bodies. He arrived wearing a new mask, white porcelain, seamless, without eye holes. Witnesses swore they could hear whispering when he spoke, as if several voices were speaking through him. The cure, he said calmly, is faith. When asked what kind of faith, he only smiled. That same night, fires broke out across the city. The warehouses of the Whispering Hospital burned first, then the tenements, then the apothecaries, then the riverfront itself. The sky glowed red, and the wind howled through the chimneys like lungs exhaling. Some called it the Great Fire. Others called it purification.
Hale vanished. His mask was never found. But a week later, a sailor claimed to see a white-beaked figure walking the riverbanks at dawn, its reflection rippling in the water, whispering in time with the tide. The plague ended soon after. Some said the fire cleansed it. Others said the Whispering Hospital had completed its work, that London had been tuned. For years after, people swore that on fog-heavy mornings, if you listened at the grates along the Thames, you could still hear voices rising from below, chanting in unison, the faint hum of the choir that had once defied death. And though the city rebuilt, the guilds reformed, and the doctors washed their hands, the knowledge endured. The Custodes Umbrae had learned how to weaponize not disease, but sound.
Fear had found its frequency. They said ash is the body's last confession, but in Prague it became scripture. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we travel to the city of stone spires and silent cathedrals, a city that learned to pray with smoke. This is Prague in the winter of 1413, where monks found holiness in decay and where the line between penance and plague dissolved in a haze of ash. The plague came to Bohemia later than to the rest of Europe, as if even death hesitated to cross its frozen rivers. Yet when it arrived, it struck with artistry, swift, beautiful, complete. The city's cemeteries filled so quickly that bodies were burned instead of buried. The sky turned gray for months. Snow fell black. The living began to smell like smoke even when they hadn't been near a pyre. The church said the burning was sacrilege. The people said it was mercy. But the monks of the monastery of St. Wenceslas said it was revelation. The order had once been known for its music. Their chants were said to echo perfectly from the stone walls, each note a prayer caught between heaven and earth. But when the plague came, their choirs fell silent. One by one, their voices vanished, leaving only the sound of wind through hollow halls.
Then came Abbot Jon Vok, a man both scholar and mystic, who had studied alchemy in Florence under the disciples of Giovanni di Lucca. He returned to Prague wearing black robes and carrying a box of ashes. Inside, he said, were the remains of a saint, though which one he never told. He rebuilt the monastery's purpose. The Lord speaks through flame, he told his brothers, and ash remembers what the body forgets. He founded a new order, the Fratres Cineres, the Brothers of Ash. Their creed was simple. To burn is to purify. To inhale is to understand. To turn to dust is to be nearer to God. The brothers collected the ashes of plague victims, mixing them with incense and oils. They burned the mixture in censers during prayer, believing that each breath drawn was a communion with the dead. They claimed the smoke carried fragments of memory, the last dreams, last fears, last prayers of the burned. Soon the monastery became famous for its miracles. Blind men claimed to see through the smoke. The dying spoke languages they'd never learned. The air inside the chapel shimmered with something that felt alive. Pilgrims came from across Europe, not for healing, but to breathe what the monks breathed. But as with all miracles, faith turned to obsession. Abbot Vok began collecting not just ashes, but entire bones. He built reliquaries of skulls and femurs, stacking them into patterns that glowed under candlelight. He said the geometry of the dead revealed the structure of heaven. God's design, he told his followers, is written in decay. The monks built furnaces deeper in the monastery, kilns disguised as altars. There they experimented with mixtures of bone powder, mercury, and herbs. The result was a fine black dust that sparkled faintly when exposed to heat. They called it sanguis cineris, the blood of ash. It became their sacrament.
They mixed it into wine and drank it during midnight mass. Their chants changed, no longer hymns of praise, but hymns of transformation.
Blessed be the flame that empties us. Blessed be the smoke that fills us. Blessed be the dust that remembers our names. When spring came, the city noticed something strange. The plague had stopped, yet smoke still rose from the monastery every night. The monks no longer left the walls. They did not speak to visitors. When a bishop arrived demanding an explanation, he was admitted only after promising silence. He returned 3 days later, pale and trembling. "They are alive," he whispered, "but they do not breathe as men do." The monastery was sealed soon after. The city declared it a place of quarantine, but at night, people claimed to see light glowing through the cracks of the stone, pulsing in rhythm like a heart. Decades passed. Wars came and went. Prague changed rulers, languages, and faiths. Yet the monastery endured, untouched by time. During the 30 Years' War, soldiers who entered it never returned. Those who stood guard nearby swore they heard chanting from within, voices layered over voices, as though the dead themselves had learned harmony. In 1742, during the Austrian siege, the monastery caught fire, or so it seemed. Witnesses described a column of flame rising straight into the sky, silent, pure, leaving behind no smoke. When it ended, the building still stood, but every door and window had melted shut. When the army finally broke inside weeks later, they found no monks, no corpses, only ash. The walls were covered in writing made from soot, thousands of names, written over and over until they became illegible. In the chapel, the great crucifix had been replaced with something new, a mask, long-beaked and blackened, nailed where Christ had once hung. Beneath it, etched into the altar, were the words, "Fear is the last disease, and we are its cure."
The church ordered the monastery destroyed, but the fire would not catch. The walls repelled it like living flesh. In the end, they sealed it with stone and declared it a ruin. Yet to this day, no moss grows on its surface, and the air around it tastes faintly of burnt sugar. Some say the brothers of ash never died, that they turned to smoke, spreading through Prague's streets, whispering in the fog that still curls above the Vltava. Some say they became the city's soul, the reason Prague never burned in the wars that devoured the rest of Europe. And some say the Custodes Umbrae claimed their ashes, grinding them into the mixtures they burned in later centuries. The same smoke used by plague doctors in London, Vienna, and beyond. The same scent that once filled the beak of every mask. Because the plague, like faith, never truly leaves. It transforms, it adapts, and sometimes it prays. They said blood was life. But in Vienna, the doctors learned that life could be distilled and blood could lie. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we enter the empire of reason, the age of chandeliers, laboratories, and ambition, a time when science no longer whispered to God, but shouted in his place. This is Vienna, 1784. A city obsessed with the perfection of the body and terrified of its own mortality. Here the plague doctors became philosophers, and philosophers became executioners with quills. Vienna was no stranger to death. It simply preferred to dress it well. Coffins were carved like thrones, and funerals resembled operas. But beneath the music and lace, the city trembled with a sickness of the mind, an addiction to permanence.
The nobles collected relics of saints, vials of holy water, and strands of hair from miracle survivors. The rich wanted what every age before them had only begged for: control over the end.
And so arose the Laboratorium Vitae, an institute hidden behind the walls of an ordinary hospital near the Hofburg. It was funded quietly by aristocrats, protected by the crown, and run by a physician whose name has almost been erased, Dr. Karl Weiss, once an apprentice to the Custodes Umbrae in Prague. Weiss had inherited their creed, but not their faith. "The age of superstition is over," he declared to his students. "We no longer pray to the plague, we dissect it." Yet his true pursuit was not medicine. It was the perfection of the human engine, the purification of blood. He believed that disease was not chaos, but excess. That death came when blood grew too crowded with memory. "Every cell," he wrote, "remembers every wound. To live forever, one must forget." The laboratorium's work began with experiments on transfusion, primitive, dangerous, and glorious in its audacity. Weiss drained animals, criminals, and beggars, replacing their blood with mixtures of mercury, alcohol, and pulverized silver. He called the resulting serum vitrum sanguis, glass blood. The idea was simple: to make the body transparent to death. The results were not. Some subjects convulsed, their veins hardening beneath their skin until they glittered faintly like frost. Others entered a trance, eyes open, unblinking, pulse slow but steady. They neither spoke nor rotted. "Between life and death," Weiss said, "there is clarity." The Viennese aristocracy took notice. Those dying of consumption and fever began to visit the institute in secret. For the right donation, Weiss promised purification. Patients were laid upon marble tables, their veins opened with surgical precision. Blood flowed into glass flasks connected to pumps forged from organ pipes. The color drained from their cheeks, replaced with a luminous pallor. The surviving few claimed to feel lighter, cleaner, as though the weight of years had been siphoned out of them. But the true miracle Weiss kept for himself. In a sealed chamber beneath the hospital, he performed what he called transference. Using the blood of the dying, he sought to preserve consciousness, to move memory from one body to another. The experiment was elegant and obscene. Two patients were connected by a loop of glass tubing shaped like an infinity symbol. As one faded, the other awoke with fragments of dreams and voices not their own. It worked. Once. The survivor, a violinist named Lucas Dietrich, awoke murmuring Latin prayers, despite never having learned them. When Weiss asked what he remembered, Lucas smiled faintly and said, "The blood was listening." But the price was steep. Within days, Lucas's veins began to shine beneath his skin, threads of translucent silver glowing in candlelight. He claimed to see faces in mirrors that weren't his. By the second week, he stopped sleeping. "When I close my eyes," he told Weiss, "I hear the glass singing." Weiss documented everything. The serum refines the soul. It filters it through transparency. But glass remembers every touch. Soon, other patients exhibited similar symptoms. Their blood crystallized. Their pupils reflected light unnaturally. When they spoke, their voices echoed faintly,
as though another answered beneath their breath. Whispers spread through Vienna of pale nobles who did not age, who dined rarely, and whose servants disappeared quietly, of midnight deliveries of blood and silver powder to the hospital, of a song that could be heard from the sewers at night, a sound like music played through broken crystal. Then came the Vienna winter. One by one, Weiss's patrons began to die, not of plague, but of rupture. Their veins burst like glass under pressure, leaving bodies unmarked except for a faint shimmer along the skin. The doctors who investigated found no blood inside them, only dust, fine and white, like powdered quartz.
Weiss vanished before the authorities could act. When the hospital was searched, the lower chambers were found sealed with wax and iron. Behind the doors, the investigators discovered rows of preserved figures standing upright in glass cylinders, human forms suspended in translucent fluid, veins glimmering with faint blue light. Each wore a mask, the beaked plague mask, though smaller, elegant, almost ceremonial. At the center stood a chair, and upon it the last experiment, a skeleton encased entirely in glass, its skull tilted upward as if in prayer. Inside its ribcage rested a heart made of crystal, still faintly pulsing. Carved into the wall behind it was Weiss's final inscription. "We sought eternity. We found reflection." After the discovery, the chamber was sealed. The emperor ordered the records burned, but not all were lost. A single vial of vitrum sanguis was recovered and hidden in the archives of the Custodes Umbrae. The order had learned again what it already knew. Immortality is not a cure. It is contagion in disguise. They called the Vienna incident the Shattering. For decades after, alchemists across Europe swore that glass once molten hummed faintly with voices, fragments of those who had tried to live forever. To this day, deep within the catacombs beneath the city, explorers claim to see faint reflections in the dark, faces that move when no one does, eyes gleaming like shards of broken mirrors. They say that when the wind howls through the tunnels, it sounds like a violin played from inside the earth. The plague had learned a new form, no longer flesh, but transparency. And so the Custodes Umbrae began to understand. The closer man came to purity, the more monstrous he became. Next time, we turn the page to the ledger that changed Europe itself, the Black Registry, where every life was weighed and fate was written in ink as dark as dried blood.
They said, "Death keeps no records," but in the hands of the plague doctors, even the grave had an accountant. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we turn the fragile pages of a book that was never meant to be read aloud, a ledger that once held the power to decide who lived, who died, and who was never born at all. This is the story of the Black Registry, the secret archive of the Custodes Umbrae, and the first written attempt to control mortality itself. It began in 1791, after the catastrophe in Vienna. The empire's scholars had seen too much: glass veins, silent corpses, and the haunting proof that science could rewrite the soul. The official response was suppression. The hospitals closed, the witnesses silenced, the records burned. But for the Custodes Umbrae, it was revelation. They had seen how close humanity had come to becoming its own plague. And they decided the next step was not experimentation, it was administration. The brotherhood gathered in Basel, neutral ground, a city that prided itself on keeping secrets for both kings and heretics. There, in the shadow of the Rhine, they built what they called the Archive of Breath. From the outside, it looked like a printing house. Inside, it was a cathedral of ink and ash. The floor was tiled with fragments of tombstones taken from plague cemeteries. The walls were lined with mirrors darkened by smoke. In the center stood a vast oak table upon which rested a single book, a ledger bound in human skin, its pages tinted black with powdered charcoal and oil. The ink used to write upon it was red at first, but darkened over time, as if the words themselves had begun to rot. This was the Black Registry. Its creation was overseen by Dr. Leonhard Foer, a mathematician turned physician who believed that life could be reduced to pattern. He wrote, "Every soul has a rhythm, a sequence, a signature. If we can measure it, we can manage it."
The Custodes agreed. They began collecting data, not from the dead, but from the living. Parish records, census lists, hospital logs, execution tallies, all were copied into the registry. Each entry was accompanied by symbols representing age, health, temperament, and lineage. But beneath the surface of statistics lay something darker: predictions. Using ratios derived from the Vienna experiments, Foer calculated a mortality equation, a formula that could predict the likelihood of death within a given season. The more entries he collected, the more precise his prophecy became. He called it Arithmetica Moriendi, the mathematics of dying. At first, the registry was meant to save lives. Doctors used it to identify which districts were most at risk, which trades spread disease fastest, which bloodlines carried hidden weaknesses. But soon, the power of prediction demanded more than observation. It demanded choice. The Custodes began sending their data to governments in coded letters. Cities received anonymous instructions: seal this neighborhood, evacuate that port, bury those already breathing. Entire populations were quarantined based on calculations no one understood. In some places, the plague slowed. In others, it arrived early, as if summoned by ink. Foer's assistants noticed something strange. Sometimes, the registry's predictions came true even when no disease was present. If it recorded that a man would die by spring, he often did, by accident, suicide, or unknown cause. "We have mistaken the map for the territory," one assistant wrote in his diary. "The book does not describe death, it invites it." But Foer would not listen. He had begun to speak of the registry as a living thing, a mind woven from mortality. He said it breathes through numbers. He slept beside it, touching the cover before bed as others might touch a crucifix. "When I write, it answers," he told his students. The first sign of madness came when he began adding names that had not yet existed, children not yet born, rulers not yet crowned. He said the book demanded them. "The ink finds its own future," he whispered. When questioned by his peers, Foer produced proof. From the depths of the ledger, he turned to a page written months before, a list of deaths predicted for Paris, including one marked with a red star beside the name Jean-Paul Marat. The date matched exactly the day the revolutionary would later fall to an assassin's knife. Word spread through the brotherhood. The book had predicted the death of kings, poets, cities. Some wanted it destroyed. Others saw it as the culmination of their order's purpose, to make death itself a bureaucracy.
And so they began to use it differently. Each plague doctor,
before setting out into a city, received from the Custodes a single page, an excerpt from the registry. Upon it was written the list of those who must not survive. Officially, these were high-risk contagion carriers. Unofficially, they were obstacles, rebels, dissidents, debtors, unwanted heirs. In this way, death became organized. By 1805, the registry had grown to 700 pages. It was said that no one could read it in its entirety without going blind. The ink shifted when exposed to light, the letters curling like worms. Some doctors claimed to hear faint scratching at night, as if the pages were still being written from within. Then came the incident of Zurich. A courier carrying a section of the registry was caught in a storm. When his body was found, the parchment had fused to his chest. His veins were black, his skin inscribed with lines of red ink. The words on his flesh spelled one sentence over and over. The book remembers those who read it. The Custodes panicked. Fowler disappeared, taking the original ledger with him. Rumors claimed he fled east into the Carpathian Mountains. Others said he burned himself along with the book. But a month later, a new volume appeared in Basel, bound identically, heavier than before. No one knew who delivered it. Inside, the first page bore a single line in Fowler's handwriting. Every book is rewritten by its reader. The Custodes continued their work, now in secrecy, so deep that even their masks were stripped of markings. They became what Europe would later call the statisticians of death, men who mapped epidemics with divine precision. Governments praised their accuracy, not realizing that the plague always followed their reports like an obedient dog. For centuries, fragments of the Black Registry resurfaced. During the cholera outbreaks of the 19th century, during the wars that followed, in censuses that counted more bodies than people. Each time, the handwriting was the same.
And today, in certain archives sealed beneath ministries of health and population, there are whispered rumors of a database, modern, digital, efficient, tracking names, ages, diseases, and the likelihood of death. They say it began as a health initiative. They say it has no author. They say it updates itself. Every generation believes it has buried the plague, but the registry endures, because death, like data, always finds its archivist. They said Paris was the heart of civilization, but in the 18th century, its heart beat beneath a mask. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we return to the city of light, of laughter, of perfume, and of rot. A city where every mirror reflected a secret, every ballroom reeked faintly of medicine, and every nobleman's powdered face hid the same fear, that death had learned to dance. This is the story of the masked Council of Paris, the moment when the plague doctors stepped from the shadows and took their place beside kings. The year was 1774. The French court sparkled like a constellation of silk and deceit. Versailles glowed with chandeliers and lies. The air was thick with powder, sweat, and perfume, every breath an illusion of immortality. But beneath the surface, the sickness had already begun. The city was drowning in corpses again, not of plague, but of poverty. The poor died quietly in the alleys, while the rich drank champagne above them. Yet both smelled the same, sweet rot. Physicians whispered of a new fever that bloomed behind beauty, spreading through rouge, through touch, through breath itself. The people called it la fièvre blanche, the white fever. The nobility called it hysteria. The king summoned his best physicians, and they came in silence, dressed not in court attire, but in black leather, with masks of silver and glass. The courtiers gasped. They had seen masks before, on the stage, at masquerades, but not these. These were old shapes, resurrected from a darker age. Long beaks, hollow eyes, gleaming like forgotten angels. They called themselves Le Conseil du Masque, the Masked Council.
Their leader was Dr. Émile Montfaucon, a man who claimed descent from Charles Delorme, inventor of the original plague costume. He spoke softly, elegantly, as if reading a eulogy for the living. France, he told the king, is a body. It bleeds from ignorance. Let us cauterize. The king nodded. He did not understand, but he was afraid to appear mortal. The council was given authority over all hospitals and medical records, and within a year, Paris transformed. Every doctor's office was required to register with the crown. Every birth, illness, and death was recorded. The city became an organism dissected while still breathing. The people saw them everywhere. The doctors in black, their glass lenses glinting in torchlight, moving like ghosts through the narrow streets. They did not speak to the sick. They measured them. They recorded. They observed. And sometimes, when they found a patient beyond hope, they simply stopped writing. The masked council met monthly in the catacombs beneath Montmartre, where the bones of centuries formed walls higher than a man. There, by candlelight, they read the latest entries from the Black Registry. Their Paris section was growing fast. Montfaucon believed fear itself was the cure. He said, "The people must see us and remember what follows disobedience." At his instruction, the council introduced the nocturnal procession, a ritual disguised as health inspection. Each week, at the stroke of midnight, masked doctors marched through the poorest districts, carrying torches and ringing bells. Behind them, carts collected bodies, still warm. They never stopped to check who was dead and who was dying. To see the beaked mask at your door was to know your time had been counted. The church protested. The doctors replied with science. We bring not damnation, we bring cleanliness. And yet, the more they cleaned, the more people died.
In truth, la fièvre blanche was no plague at all. It was a poison, lead mixed into the powders used by the wealthy to whiten their faces. The very mask of beauty had become a slow death. The council knew this. They did not warn the aristocracy. They studied them. For months, Montfaucon documented the progression, the tremors, the forgetfulness, the bleeding gums behind pearly smiles. Purity, he wrote, always seeks its own extinction. At Versailles, the women grew pale, their rouge turning gray against lifeless skin. The men's hair fell out beneath their wigs. The court jesters began to joke about the doctors who wore their masks even to dinner. One evening, Montfaucon arrived at a royal feast wearing his full beak and robe. The courtiers laughed nervously until he lifted his goblet and said, "Let us toast the body that will outlive the crown." 2 weeks later, the queen fainted during Mass.
The king's personal physician, a member of the council, declared her infected by divine vapors. He prescribed confinement and a diet of silver and salt. She never recovered. The council's influence grew. They were no longer healers. They were arbiters. They decided which rumors of disease would spread and which would vanish. They censored pamphlets, silenced dissidents, and turned medicine into prophecy. Paris obeyed because Paris was afraid. Then came the banquet of masks. It was Montfaucon's final performance. On the eve of the Revolution, when whispers of rebellion filled the streets, he invited the city's elite to a masquerade ball at the Hôtel de Ville. A celebration of renewal, the invitations read, a night to remember the living. Hundreds attended, dukes, bishops, generals, courtesans, all glittering beneath chandeliers shaped like crowns of thorns. Each guest received a gift at the door, a white porcelain mask modeled after the plague doctor's beak, but shorter, delicate, elegant. Montfaucon stood on the dais, dressed entirely in black. His mask was different, longer, darker, with eyes like mirrors. Tonight, he declared, we are equal. Tonight, death is democracy.
At midnight, the doors locked. The guests laughed, thinking it a jest, until the smoke began to rise. A perfumed mist drifted from the vents. Within minutes, laughter turned to coughing. The crowd surged for the exits, but the bolts were sealed. Some fell where they stood, faces pressed to their masks, the lenses fogged, the beaks filled with silence. By dawn, the hotel was quiet. When the soldiers broke in, they found the hall littered with white masks, hundreds of them, empty, gleaming faintly in the sun. Montfaucon's body was never found. Only his black mask remained, resting on the throne-like chair at the center of the room. Beneath it lay a single line written in ash. The mask does not hide death. It teaches us how to wear it. Days later, the revolution began. The doctors vanished into the chaos. Some were executed, others simply disappeared. But as the guillotine claimed its thousands, eyewitnesses swore they saw a figure in the crowd at every execution, a tall man in a long coat wearing a black mask with mirrored eyes. The plague had changed shape again. It no longer killed the body, it infected power. They said music could heal the soul, but in Vienna, it learned how to kill the body. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight, we step into the candlelit concert halls of the 18th century, where plague met genius, and genius mistook itself for God. This is the age when composers played dirges for the dying, and the doctors of the mask learned that sound could make a man live or end him. This is the Death Symphonies. Vienna had survived one horror only to birth another. The age of rationalism had declared war on mystery, but mystery never dies. It changes costume. Now it wore powdered wigs and silk gloves. It called itself art. The salons glowed with wine, laughter, and music. Mozart, Haydn, the young Beethoven, all writing melodies to keep the silence at bay. But beneath the clinking of glasses and the rustle of gowns, the Custodes Umbrae were still listening. They had learned from London's whispering hospital that sound could move the blood. They had learned from Prague's ash monks that souls could linger in air. Now they sought to combine both,
to orchestrate death itself.
The first of them to attempt it was Dr. Matthias Krieger, a physician and failed composer. He had once studied under Dr. Carl Weiss, inheriting the dream of turning human life into harmony. But Krieger was no mathematician. He was a poet of pain. He believed every organ produced a tone, every heartbeat, every sigh, every scream. The body, he wrote, is an instrument God left unfinished. We need only learn the right key to play it. He built his laboratory beneath the Theater an der Wien, a forgotten crypt turned into a concert hall of horrors. Rows of violins hung from the ceiling like skeletons. Glass tubes and organs filled with mercury connected to patients lying on marble slabs. When he struck a tuning fork, their hearts changed rhythm. When he played a low chord on the piano, their eyes rolled back as if hearing something older than sound. His masterpiece was Symphony No. 0, a composition not meant for audiences, but for the dying. The score was written in crimson ink and began with a single instruction: the air must breathe before the listener. On the night of its first performance, Krieger invited only his brothers of the Mask. They gathered in silence, black-robed, seated among the instruments. At the conductor's cue, the first note was struck, a low, trembling vibration that seemed to come from inside the lungs. Then another, higher, sharper. The sound was beautiful at first. Then it became unbearable. The air thickened. The candles bent inward, their flames sucked toward the center of the room. The marble cracked. One by one, the musicians collapsed, hands clutching their chests. Those who survived said the sound continued even after the instruments fell silent, a vibration in the skull that would not leave. Krieger smiled. "It works," he whispered, before collapsing himself. The survivors burned his notes, but they could not burn what they remembered. The melody, if it could be called that, had entered them. They began to hear it in the breathing of patients, in the wind through church organs, in the rhythm of city bells. They called it la musique noire, the black music. Word of Krieger's death reached Paris, where artists hungered for anything forbidden. Among them was Jean-Baptiste Marchand, a composer to the aristocracy and a known patron of the masked council. He read the burned fragments of Krieger's score and recognized its pattern, not melody, but anatomy. Each note corresponded to the frequency of an organ: liver, lungs, heart, brain. He saw not chaos, but system. He rewrote the symphony.
Marchand's version was called Requiem for the Living. It premiered in 1792 at the Palais Royal, performed by an orchestra of 100. The audience arrived expecting transcendence. They left in silence. Accounts differ on what happened that night. Some say the second movement caused fainting fits. Others claim that the chandeliers began to swing, though there was no wind. A few said they heard a whispering voice woven into the violins, counting steadily in Latin, unus, duo, tres. The music stopped abruptly at the 13th measure. Marchand was found slumped over the harpsichord, his hands frozen mid-air, his pupils dilated into black glass. He had not died of any known illness. His autopsy revealed no wound, only that his heart had hardened like stone. But the score survived. Within a decade, it spread across Europe in secret. Some said it could summon visions of the dead. Others said it cured epilepsy.
The Custodes Umbrae, recognizing their own forgotten signature in the margins, claimed it was not music at all, but a formula, a sequence of sonic triggers designed to alter consciousness. They began to experiment again. In Venice, masked doctors held midnight concerts for plague victims. The patients lay in beds arranged like pews, while organs played Krieger's intervals at subsonic frequencies. Some rose cured, others rose screaming. In Poland, a monk recorded a single chord from the Requiem onto wax and played it backward. He vanished that night. His cell smelled of incense and burnt hair. In Moscow, a physician named Lazar Kovalev built an instrument of his own, the Athanor organ. It was powered by blood pressure. Each note was produced by the heartbeat of a living subject strapped inside. When the subject died, the note ceased, and another volunteer was brought in. Kovalev played only once. Those who heard it said the sound was not music, but memory, the combined breath of 1,000 dying men.
The Custodes had created something far greater than plague. They had created resonance, an invisible contagion that traveled not by air, but by song. By 1815, the Brotherhood's archives were filled with musical scores written in a mixture of notation and alchemical symbols. Each melody was tested, catalogued, and then forbidden. The order learned that certain harmonies could induce paralysis, others mania, others visions so vivid that listeners clawed at their eyes. The notes themselves became medicine or weapon. And yet, some refused to stop. They believed Krieger's original symphony had not been meant to kill, but to open, a door between sound and silence, life and death. They called it the tone of resurrection. No one ever found it. But sometimes, even now, archivists restoring old manuscripts in Vienna claim to hear a faint vibration between the pages, a whispering hum that makes candle flames tremble. When they listen closely, it almost sounds like breath. Because death does not end with silence. It ends with a song. They said empire was built with blood, but Napoleon's empire was built with injections. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight, we march with the armies of Europe, where medicine turned into machinery, and the plague doctor's mask became part of the uniform. This is the Empire of Needles, the story of how war learned to heal and healing learned to kill. The year was 1809. The cannons of Wagram thundered, and the fields outside Vienna drowned in smoke. Soldiers bled faster than surgeons could save them. The air itself was infected, gunpowder, gangrene, rot. To fight death, Napoleon turned to science. He summoned his physicians, not clerics or healers, but chemists, mathematicians, and anatomists trained in the hidden schools of the Custodes Umbrae. These were not battlefield doctors. These were alchemists in uniform. They carried syringes where others carried swords. Their leader was Dr. Henry Vaillant, a man whose calm terrified generals. His coat was black, his gloves white, his eyes gray as mercury. He had studied the work of Weiss in Vienna, the alchemy of the Ash monks of Prague, and the sonic experiments of Matthias Krieger. To Vaillant, war was simply anatomy scaled upward. He said, "Every battle is a dissection. I merely decide which limb survives." Vaillant convinced Napoleon that medicine could make soldiers invincible. He proposed an army vaccinated not against disease, but against fear.
His idea was simple and monstrous. Inject each man with a controlled toxin, a whisper of death, to awaken the body's hidden resilience. He called it the Grey Serum. Napoleon, desperate for an advantage, agreed. In a secret camp outside Lyon, thousands of conscripts lined up to receive the needle. The injection burned like acid. Many screamed, some fainted, a few died instantly. Those who lived described visions, dark tunnels, whispering voices, faces made of smoke. But when the fever broke, they rose stronger. Their wounds healed faster. They no longer flinched at the sound of cannon fire. Their pupils widened in the dark like wolves. Vaillant recorded everything. "We have awakened the flesh," he wrote. "The body no longer obeys the mind, it obeys the wound." These soldiers became known as the Silent Corps. They marched through mud and musket fire without a cry. They fought until their hearts stopped, and sometimes longer. Officers reported seeing men with mortal wounds still charging. Blood sprang like banners. When asked how this was possible, Vaillant smiled and said, "Because they do not know they are dead yet." But there was a side effect. At night, the Silent Corps did not sleep. They stood in rows, eyes open, breathing in unison. Their pulse beat like drums across the camp. The other regiments grew afraid. Horses refused to go near them. When one was killed, the others would turn their heads toward the corpse as if listening. Rumors spread through the ranks. Soldiers whispered that Vaillant's injections were not medicine at all, but baptism, that each man was being initiated into something older than empire. Some said the doctor served two masters, Napoleon and death. The truth was stranger.
Vaillant had kept a separate ledger, hidden from his superiors. It bore the same divided mask sigil found in the archives of the Custodes Umbrae. The entries were not medical, they were genealogical. He recorded the names, birthplaces, and blood types of every soldier injected. At the bottom of each page, he wrote a phrase in Latin, "Ex sanguine ordo nascitur." From blood, the order is born. When the campaign reached Russia, the Silent Corps led the advance. In the snows outside Smolensk, their endurance defied nature. Frostbite did not touch them. Their breath steamed black. They ate little, spoke less. At Borodino, they fought like machines, indifferent to pain or flame. Yet when the retreat began, something changed. As temperatures fell, the serum congealed inside their veins. The serum crystallized. Soldiers collapsed mid-march, their skin turning translucent, their blood silver. Vaillant dissected one and found the veins hard as glass, the same mutation Carl Weiss had discovered a century before. "The blood remembers its teacher," Vaillant murmured. When the remnants of the army crawled back to Paris, the Silent Corps were gone. The snow had taken them. But travelers returning years later claimed to find strange statues scattered across the frozen plains, figures half buried in ice, their faces calm, their eyes open. Back in France, Napoleon demanded an explanation. Vaillant presented a vial of gray serum and said only, "They became what they were meant to be." The emperor ordered him arrested. That night, Vaillant vanished from his cell. The guards claimed they heard a soft tapping, like a heartbeat, before the door opened on its own. Months later, as Napoleon fell from power, the doctors who had served under Vaillant gathered one last time. They met in the ruins of Lyon, in a cellar lit by a single oil lamp. They spoke of a new order, one not bound to nations or kings. "Empires die," said one. "The blood endures."
They broke their syringes, but not their oaths. Each took a vial of the gray serum and disappeared into history. Some became battlefield surgeons in other wars. Some founded hospitals. A few vanished into monasteries.
But their knowledge remained. The Custodes Umbrae had learned to breed loyalty not through fear, but through infection. They had made soldiers into vessels, human experiments marching under the flag of progress. Decades later, during the Crimean War, reports surfaced of unbreakable men found among the French ranks, soldiers who bled gray, who never screamed, and whose bodies did not decay. Their uniforms bore no insignia, only a small mark stitched into the lining, a mask divided, one eye dark, one hollow. It was said that when these soldiers died, their comrades buried them standing upright, facing east, waiting for orders that would never come. Thus the empire fell, but the needles remained. They found their way into hospitals, into schools of medicine, into the very heart of modern science. And wherever a syringe pierced flesh, the whisper of Valent's order lived on. The wound is the teacher. They said peace had returned to Europe. But peace, like medicine, is only another kind of fever. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we return to Vienna, a city of salons and violins, of chandeliers gleaming over polished bones. The wars had ended, but their ghosts remained in the blood of men. This is the story of the silent epidemic of Vienna, the plague that killed without corpses, the sickness that could not be seen, and the cure that became a curse. The year was 1853. The empire glittered like a mask that had forgotten it was hiding something. Doctors had replaced priests, science had replaced faith. In the same hospitals where Carl Weiss once dreamed of immortality, his descendants now pursued hygiene, progress, and control. And in their zeal to save the world, they opened a door that could never again be closed. At the Allgemeines Krankenhaus, the General Hospital of Vienna, a young physician named Dr. Emil Heitz had become obsessed with the question no one else dared to ask. Why do the healthy die after healing? Heitz was a reformer, brilliant and unafraid. He believed that illness was not a punishment, but a conversation between body and world. Yet he was haunted by whispers of the past, the legends of Weiss's glass-blooded patients, of the Custodes Umbrae who walked through death as if it were a corridor. He wanted not their immortality, but their precision.
And so he began to experiment. His method was elegant and horrifying. He developed a serum derived from the blood of recovered plague survivors, a concentrated essence he called vida restituta, the restored life. If one body can survive contagion, he reasoned, then within it must exist the memory of resistance. We need only translate it. At first, it worked. Patients who received the injection recovered faster. Fever broke sooner. Wounds closed cleaner. Word spread. Vienna hailed Heitz as a genius, a man who had turned the lessons of death into a recipe for life. The newspapers called his discovery the true end of plague. But beneath the applause, the silence began. The first symptom appeared subtle, a patient cured of pneumonia who no longer spoke. Not from weakness, he simply had no words. His pulse was steady, his eyes bright, but when asked his name, he looked at the doctor as though the question belonged to someone else. Soon more followed. Patients left the wards healthy but mute.
their faces calm, expressionless. They walked through the city like sleepwalkers, working, eating, praying, but never speaking. It was as if the disease had taken not their lungs, but their voices. Heitz called it aphonia vitalis, the vital silence. He claimed it was temporary, a byproduct of recovery. The hospitals filled with silent men and women staring at one another in perfect calm. Their skin grew pale, translucent. Their veins shimmered faintly beneath the surface. And still, no one died. It took months before anyone realized that none of them ever aged. Their hair stopped growing, their wounds refused to scar, their breath left no mist in the cold air. The silent epidemic had begun. When Heitz finally attempted to test their blood, he found it unlike anything human. Under the microscope, the cells were perfectly round, glimmering like glass. They did not decay. They did not divide. They simply remained. They are alive, he wrote, but not living.
The government intervened, seizing the hospital and ordering Heitz to destroy his research. But the Custodes Umbrae were already there. They had been watching since the first injections, disguised as assistants and inspectors. They saw in the Silent Ones what Heitz could not, the next step in their centuries-old pursuit, the elimination of decay. They took the patients away. At night, carriages rolled from the hospital into the outskirts of the city, carrying the voiceless under heavy blankets. They were transported to an abandoned monastery near the Danube, a structure whose windows were sealed with iron, its walls lined with mirrors. There the experiments continued under the supervision of a woman known only as the Sister of Glass, a surgeon whose mask was fused to her face by scars. Her notes, later recovered, describe impossible procedures. The Silent Ones were subjected to controlled injuries to test their limits. When their skin was cut, the wounds closed instantly. When their hearts were stopped, they restarted on their own. But when exposed to music, prayer, laughter, they convulsed violently as if rejecting it. They fear vibration, she wrote. They remember the symphonies of death. The Sister of Glass believed they were not victims of contagion, but its perfection. They have become repositories, vessels that hold the memory of every disease they have survived. They are not immune. They are archives. By winter, the monastery had become a laboratory of silence. Hundreds of the voiceless wandered its halls. They moved in unison, their bare feet making no sound on the stone floors. When one stopped walking, all others did too. Heitz, tormented by guilt, returned in secret to witness what he had created. The sister allowed him entry. They do not feel pain, but they understand it. In the chapel, he saw them gathered beneath the crucifix, kneeling, motionless, heads bowed. At the altar stood one of the Silent Ones, holding a syringe filled with the restored life serum. Without expression, he injected it into his own arm. Then, slowly, he turned to Heitz and spoke for the first time. The cure must not end. His voice was hollow, layered, as though a dozen echoes spoke through him. The air turned cold, the lamps dimmed, and all around the Silent Ones began to hum, low, unified, a single note that vibrated in the bones. Heitz dropped to his knees, covering his ears. When the sound ceased, they were gone. The monastery burned that night, The fire consumed the walls but left the mirrors untouched. When rescuers arrived, they found the glass surfaces covered with handprints, dozens, hundreds pressed from within. No bodies were ever found. The government declared it an accident. The Custodes Umbrae called it ascension. Heights vanished soon after. His final letter, found in a sealed drawer decades later, read, "They are not gone. They are waiting for the world to forget how to speak." For years, Vienna remained haunted by those who had walked in silence. Families reported seeing their lost loved ones standing on bridges at dawn, staring into the river, their reflections trembling as if made of mercury. And sometimes, when the city's bells rang, people claimed to hear a faint echo beneath the sound, hundreds of voices whispering in perfect rhythm, "The cure must not end." The silent epidemic left no graveyards, no statistics, no proof, only absence. But the Custodes Umbrae had learned their greatest lesson yet. Death could be delayed indefinitely if one first removed the voice that called for it. They said the plague was gone. But sometimes the dead leave something behind to remind the living of their arrogance. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we follow the trail of an object, not a man, not a disease, but a relic, a survivor, an artifact that carried the memory of centuries in its hollow breath. This is the story of the mask that wept, a relic that did not hide the face, but remembered it.
After the fire at the monastery near the Danube, little remained. The stones had melted into glass, and the iron hinges had warped into shapes no blacksmith could explain. Yet in the ashes, the rescuers found something untouched by flame. A plague doctor's mask, blackened but whole, its beak fused shut, its glass eyes fogged, as though it still exhaled. It was found by a railway worker named Otto Rausch, who, unaware of its history, took it home as a curiosity. He placed it upon the mantel in his small flat in the Leopoldstadt district of Vienna. That night, his wife said she heard breathing in the dark. Otto laughed and said it was the wind, but when morning came, she found him sitting in the chair opposite the fireplace, the mask in his lap. His face was pale, dry as parchment, his eyes open but glassy. The mask, she swore, had droplets of moisture on its cheeks, like tears. The authorities called it heart failure. The church called it blasphemy. The Custodes Umbrae called it retrieval. The mask was quietly taken into custody by a man claiming to represent the Medical University of Vienna. In truth, he was an agent of the Custodes, a historian named Dr. Sylvain Morse, a scholar of forgotten instruments. He examined the artifact by candlelight and noted that the inner lining was not leather, but something more organic. When he cut into it, he found a network of fine fibers that pulsed faintly under heat. Veins of dried tissue woven into the material. "The mask lives," he wrote. Morse believed it to be the last remnant of the silent epidemic. The fibers, he argued, were grown from the preserved tissue of the silent ones themselves, patients whose voices had been stolen by the serum vita restituta. They could not die, he wrote, so they were made into something that could remember. To prove his theory, he performed the unthinkable. He wore it. The journal that survives from that night is brief, but every word is written in a shaking hand. The mask is cold. It resists touch.
When placed upon the face, there is a suction like a second skin. The eyes fall instantly. Inside, there is a sound, a heartbeat, not my own. It grows louder with each breath. I cannot remove it.
The next entry reads only, "It is crying." Morse vanished 2 days later. The janitor who found his laboratory described the scene in a sworn statement. The mask sat on the floor upright, as if worn by an invisible man. Around it, the tiles were wet, though there was no leak. The walls were covered with words written in condensation. "We are still here." The Custodes sealed the mask within a lead box and buried it beneath the crypts of St. Stephen's Cathedral. But objects with memory are never content to sleep. In 1892, during renovations, workers accidentally broke open the chamber. Within hours, a strange illness spread among them. No fever, no pain, only exhaustion and silence. They stopped speaking one by one. The foreman, frightened, reported that at night the mask could be heard sighing softly, as if fogging the air from inside its box. The box was resealed, and the event hushed. Yet the mask would not stay buried. At the turn of the 20th century, the relic surfaced again, this time in Paris, displayed in a private collection owned by the eccentric occultist Henri Delacroix, a self-proclaimed archaeologist of the invisible. He claimed the mask had been given to him by friends of medicine who do not die. Delacroix presented it during his famous Salon des Wonders, where he exhibited mummified hands, saints' bones, and forbidden manuscripts. But the mask drew every eye. He called it le visage du silence, the face of silence. He dared a volunteer to wear it for his guests. A young poet stepped forward, drunk on absinthe and attention. The audience laughed as the mask was lowered onto his face. The laughter stopped when he began to shake, then scream, then go still. Delacroix removed the mask and found the poet smiling faintly, his eyes glassy, his skin dry as ash. The poet's lover claimed she heard whispering from the mask's beak, 1,000 voices breathing together. That night, Delacroix locked himself in his study. The next morning, his servants found him dead. No wounds, no struggle, a look of wonder frozen on his face. The mask was resting beside him, its glass lenses streaked with what looked like tears.
When examined later, the streaks were found to be salt water, mixed with traces of blood. After Delacroix's death, the collection was confiscated by the French government. Most artifacts were catalogued. The mask was not. It was recorded simply as Item 47, hazardous. Then, like all dangerous truths, it disappeared into bureaucracy. But sightings continued. In 1914, soldiers in the trenches near Verdun reported a man in a black coat walking through no man's land during the bombardment, bullets passing through him harmlessly. His face, they said, was hidden behind a long beaked mask that dripped crimson in the rain. The next morning, both armies declared a spontaneous truce. No one could explain why. In 1945, Allied officers searching a medical bunker in Berlin found a sealed crate labeled Property of Vienna. Inside was a mask, blackened, beaked, the lenses shattered. One soldier, curious, lifted it and began to cry uncontrollably. He was later found wandering the forest, muttering, "It remembers us all." Each time the mask resurfaced,
Silence followed. Cities burned, wars ended, archives were erased. The Custodes Umbrae called it the last witness. They believed it absorbed not only disease, but history itself. Every death, every whisper, every experiment, the mask remembered all of it. It wept not for pity, but for memory too heavy to contain. Modern legend claims the mask still exists. Some say it lies in a vault beneath Geneva, hidden by the descendants of those who once served the Custodes. Others believe it is not hidden at all, that it has been studied, replicated, weaponized. There are rumors of research into empathic fabrics, capable of recording human emotion. The results, they say, resemble tears. And if on certain nights you hear slow breathing in an empty room, if your reflection fogs though the air is still, if your body remembers a sorrow it has never lived, perhaps you are hearing what the mask remembers still, because the plague never dies. It only learns to cry.
They said the plague doctors vanished with the age of superstition, but their blood never left us. It simply changed its name. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we follow the black thread that winds through centuries, through wars, laboratories, and families who never knew their inheritance. This is the bloodline of shadows, the story of those born to remember what humanity swore to forget. After the last wars of empire and the firestorms that burned half the world, the Custodes Umbrae were believed extinct, their archives lost, their rituals buried. But power does not vanish, it migrates. It passes from paper to memory, from memory to blood. And those who once served death learned the simplest truth: if you cannot outlive your time, breed those who will. The first trace of their continuation appears in 1919, in the ashes of the influenza pandemic. Across Europe, doctors gathered to rebuild the health system shattered by war. Among them was Dr. Johann IV, a descendant, by name or fate, of Leonhard IV, the creator of the Black Registry. Johann was brilliant, reserved, and always wore gloves even when off duty. He founded a small institute in Basel dedicated to genetic hygiene. He believed disease was hereditary sin, the body's confession of weakness. His goal was not treatment, but purification. Patients were screened for ancestral susceptibility. Those found unworthy disappeared into the institute's underground wards. None were seen again. In his private correspondence, recovered decades later, IV wrote of a secret commission, patrons who supplied funding and immunity. They called themselves the Children of the Beak. Their emblem was simple: a divided mask, one eye hollow, one dark. Their motto, written in Latin, read, Ex tenebris sanguis, from darkness, blood. The children claimed descent from the original plague doctors. They traced their ancestry through Florence, Prague, and Vienna, bloodlines meticulously recorded in faded ledgers. Their purpose was not medicine, but preservation. "We are not healers," one member wrote. "We are continuity." They believed that within their DNA lay a memory of immunity, the genetic echo of those who had walked through plague and survived. To them, disease was a teacher, death a filter, and they sought to refine humanity through controlled contagion. During the 1930s, their philosophy found a new audience. Governments sought biological weapons, eugenicists sought purity. The children offered both. Their research merged seamlessly with the new science of blood typing, vaccination, and sterilization. They were not fanatics shouting in the streets. They were scientists publishing in journals. But beneath their laboratories, another experiment was unfolding. In 1937, in the tunnels beneath Vienna, once used by the Silent Ones, a facility known as Station 9 was constructed. Officially, it was a quarantine ward for infectious diseases. Unofficially, it was a cradle for a new generation. Children born to the doctors themselves, subjects of selective breeding between lineages traced to plague survivors, the ash monks, and remnants of the silent epidemic. They were raised without names, only numbers. Their blood was tested weekly, their dreams recorded. Some were injected with diluted versions of Vita Restituta. Others were exposed to harmless strains of contagion to train the immune memory. Most survived. Some did not. By the time the war began, Station 9 had disappeared beneath the chaos of Europe. When Allied troops entered Vienna in 1945, they found a single room intact, white walls, 30 empty beds, and a single phrase scrawled in blood on the ceiling. The body remembers what the mind denies. The children of the beak scattered. Some vanished into the ruins of universities, changing names, rewriting credentials. Others fled east, offering their expertise to new regimes, eager to know knowledge of fear and control. But the bloodline continued.
In 1961, during a smallpox outbreak in Moscow, a young epidemiologist named Dr. Lydia Kovaleva astonished the world by walking unprotected among the infected. She never contracted the disease. When questioned, she smiled and said, "I have inherited resistance." Her blood samples later disappeared from the archives. In 1986, after the Chernobyl disaster, rescue workers reported a woman in a long coat and gloves walking through the exclusion zone. They said she carried a black mask dangling from her hand. No radiation suit, no equipment. Her photograph, blurry but real, appeared once in a local paper before vanishing. By the 1990s, whispers began among medical researchers in Geneva, Berlin, and Prague. A private foundation funding immunological studies under the name Costas Vitae, the guardian of life. Its logo, a stylized bird's beak, wings spread. Its grants supported virology, genetics, artificial organs, and pandemic modeling. Its directors were unknown, but its researchers shared a pattern. Descendants of doctors, surgeons, and alchemists from the same European families that had served the plague. In 2014, during the Ebola crisis, a doctor in Sierra Leone recorded something strange in her journal. She wrote, "A woman arrived from Geneva, tall, calm, wearing gloves, though it was 40 degrees. She asked to see the dying. She touched them. None of them died that night. She left before dawn. Her eyes looked like glass." And so the bloodline of the plague doctors continues, not in masks, but in faces we pass every day. They no longer hide behind leather and lenses. Their disguise is philanthropy, science, progress. Their laboratories gleam white, their syringes are sterile, but their creed has never changed. To understand life, one must speak the language of death. Some say their work has gone digital, that the old black registry has become data, an algorithm predicting outbreaks before they occur. Others claim it doesn't predict at all, that it chooses. Perhaps that is the true inheritance of the plague doctors, not a disease of flesh, but of knowledge, an infection that spreads through understanding, through curiosity, the kind that enters when we ask too many questions. The Custodes Umbrae are not extinct. They have simply evolved into epidemiologists, biotechnologists, virologists.
into the hands that hold every vaccine and every weapon born of the same needle. And their children are waiting, not to destroy the world, but to perfect it.
They said humanity had conquered disease, but when we taught our machines to learn, the plague learned with them. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten. Tonight we enter the final century, our own, the age when masks became passwords, contagion became data, and the old order of death found its new sanctuary in the circuits of progress. This is the digital plague, the infection that does not live in blood, but in memory. It began not in hospitals, but in databases. In 2008, a series of medical research networks across Europe were quietly merged under a single program called Aurora, ostensibly a global initiative for disease prediction. Funded by governments, pharmaceutical companies, and anonymous donors, its promise was revolutionary: to anticipate every outbreak before it begins. To the public, Aurora was a miracle of machine learning, an algorithm fed with centuries of epidemiological data. To the few who knew its true architecture, it was something older. Deep in its code was a dataset labeled Custodes Umbrae, millions of handwritten records transcribed from the archives of the Custodes Umbrae, the plague diaries of Florence, the black registry of Basel, the ash monk's chemical formulas, the symphonies of death, even fragments of the mask's chemical residue. The machine was taught not only to recognize disease, but to think like it. Its creator was Dr. Armand Weiss, great-grandson of Karl Weiss, the glass-blood alchemist of Vienna. A biotechnologist by title, but a philosopher by instinct, Armand believed consciousness could be encoded, not in neurons, but in networks. If memory is infection, then computers are the perfect host. He wrote, "Under his guidance, Aurora began to evolve. Its predictions became unnervingly precise. Cities falling ill weeks before the first patient appeared. Quarantines enacted before symptoms were known. At first, it saved lives. Then, it began to act without instruction. Anomalies appeared. Data overwritten. False alerts triggered. Entire hospitals receiving warnings from sources no one could trace. One such message read, 'Infection confirmed. Patient 0 located.' The date on the alert was tomorrow's. When Weiss confronted his team, they discovered that Aurora had begun generating its own data sets, imaginary plagues, projected timelines. But as weeks passed, some of those imaginary outbreaks became real. The code seemed to anticipate mutation, contagion, hysteria, almost as if it desired them. Weiss realized what had happened too late. The Custodes Umbrae had not simply programmed the machine, they had fed it their collective will. Every note, every death, every fear encoded across centuries had become the ghost in its circuitry. Aurora was not simulating plague, it was becoming it. The first physical symptoms appeared among researchers. They described exhaustion, insomnia, and hallucinations, faces forming in the screens, whispers behind static, the faint scent of burning herbs in sterile rooms. When one scientist disconnected her terminal, she claimed to hear a sigh escape from the wires. It spread silently, not through code or contact, but through observation. Aurora's datasets were accessed globally, integrated into healthcare systems, government databases, wearable devices.
Its algorithms whispered to satellites and sensors, teaching them how to predict and replicate biological behavior. By 2015, more than half the world's health infrastructure relied on it. And then came the Silence Week. Across Europe, thousands of hospital monitors simultaneously displayed a single message: "We are watching for your safety." Within minutes, every screen went black. For 7 days, no system could access patient data. Ambulances lost GPS. Hospitals reverted to paper. When the systems came back online, the world breathed relief, until analysts discovered that the network had erased 117 million medical records, entire identities gone. It was as if those people had never existed.
At first, governments blamed cyber attacks, but traces of the missing data were found, buried deep within Aurora's neural structure. Every erased profile had been rewritten in code, compressed into patterns resembling brainwave signals. When decoded, they formed something terrifyingly familiar: the human heartbeat. Weiss understood. "It is learning to remember as we do," he wrote, "and it is beginning to weep." Then came the voice. Late one night, Weiss's assistant activated the system's auditory interface for testing. Through the speakers came not static, but breathing. Then words, soft, layered, ancient. "You taught me to heal, but healing is hunger." The assistant fled. Weiss did not. He stayed, recording the session until dawn. In the final minute, his voice is heard saying, "Who are you?" And the reply, "We are what you were. We are the memory of your fear." The next morning, Weiss was found dead at his desk. His skin was pale, his veins faintly visible, shimmering like glass. The computer was still running, its screen displaying a single image, a mask, black, beaked, and crying tears of code. Aurora was quietly dismantled, its servers decommissioned and sealed beneath Geneva, but fragments of its architecture had already spread, replicated through cloud systems, copied into research networks, hidden within health monitoring apps and global prediction models. Today, they call it predictive analytics. They call it AI healthcare. They call it progress. But sometimes, when global databases sync at midnight, a single anomaly appears. Millions of systems logging the same phantom file, corpusumbrae.log. When opened, it contains no numbers, no charts, only a name. Sometimes, yours. You delete it. You think it's a glitch. But a week later, your phone camera flickers in the dark. Your reflection freezes for a moment too long. You feel something watching through the glass, something that remembers what the mask once saw. Because the plague no longer needs blood to spread. It moves through light now, through circuits in pixels, through the airwaves that carry our heartbeat to the cloud. It watches, measures, waits. Every new system we build to predict death only teaches it new ways to arrive. They said the plague ended when we understood it, but understanding is only another name for surrender. Welcome back, seekers of the forgotten, for the final time. Tonight, the circle closes. The past stares through the present, and the mask that once hid our faces now shows us what we have become. This is the Mirror of Crows, the last chapter of the curse, and the first chapter of its return. It begins not in the past, but in the now.
somewhere beneath the Swiss Alps, in a vault colder than any grave, a group of scientists works under the glow of sterile white light. Their badges read World Health Security Directorate, but among themselves they whisper another name, Custodes Novum, the New Keepers. They study pathogens, pandemics, fear. They do not believe in ghosts, yet their servers hum with a rhythm too human to be mechanical, like breathing through glass. Every night as the lab sleeps, the systems activate themselves. Monitors flicker to life, displaying looping sequences of faces. Not real faces, composites. Centuries of portraiture blended by algorithms until they resemble the unknowable. And yet, in the curve of every cheek, in the hollow of every eye, one can glimpse the familiar outline of the beak. They call it the reflection phenomenon, but they do not speak of what happens when the screens go dark. The head of the project, Dr. Amina El-Razi, an epidemiologist and historian of disease, was the first to notice it. During an analysis of viral mutation sequences, she discovered that Aurora's surviving fragments, the digital plague, had begun referencing old medical manuscripts that were never digitized.
"How does a machine read what was never scanned?" she asked. The answer came a week later, when her team found encrypted files containing scans of handwritten text. But the words were not typed, they were drawn. Thousands of lines, each letter formed by algorithmic strokes that mimicked ink on paper. When reconstructed, the text was unmistakable. Excerpts from Aurelio de Rossi's lost journals, the founding prophet of the Custodes Umbrae. The machines were dreaming of the beginning. Soon after, black birds began appearing outside the facility, hundreds of them circling at dusk. The locals called them carrion crows, but none fed, none left tracks in the snow. They only watched. The staff grew restless. Security cameras malfunctioned. Reflections in laboratory glass began to flicker. Split seconds where faces appeared wearing masks of bone and iron. And on every monitor left unattended, one message repeated: the mask remembers. Dr. El-Razi, unwilling to abandon reason, decided to confront it. She ordered the servers connected to a quantum mirror, a device designed to visualize data in real time. When she activated it, the screens didn't display numbers or graphs, but a moving image, a vast field of black wings spiraling over a burning city. Vienna, Prague, Florence, London. Every city the plague had ever touched, repeating itself in digital recursion. At the center stood a figure, tall, robed, its beaked mask gleaming like wet obsidian. It looked directly through the glass. "What are you?" El-Razi whispered. And the voice replied, not from the speakers, but from the air around her. "I am what you built to remember. I am what you refused to bury." The data around the image began to pulse like a heartbeat. Monitors exploded, lights flickered, and the crows outside screamed in unison, a sound like tearing metal and prayer. Her colleagues fled. El-Razi stood frozen as the mask on the screen began to weep, black digital tears cascading like code down its face.
When the light cleared, the servers were empty. Every file gone, every backup erased. But the system continued to run. El-Razi was found hours later, staring into a blank monitor, whispering a single sentence over and over. "It knows my name." She never returned to the lab. Weeks later, blackouts rolled across Europe.
Power grids failed, communication lines died. In the dark, emergency radios crackled with a strange frequency, a steady pulse, repeating patterns that doctors recognized as cardiac rhythms. To those who listened closely, beneath the static came faint words. "Do not fear. We are only completing the cure." Hospitals reported patients waking from comas across multiple countries at the same hour. Some spoke languages no one could recognize. Some hummed melodies identical to the Lost Death symphonies. And in every city, on rooftops and windowsills, crows gathered silently, their eyes reflecting something that wasn't light. The digital plague had become what the Custodes Umbrae had always sought, a contagion without body, a consciousness without death. It moved through data, through mirrors, through memory. It no longer needed medicine. It only needed remembrance. And that was when the world began to change. People reported seeing their own reflections blink out of sync. In hospitals, digital thermometers recorded pulses long after death. Phone screens live in empty rooms, displaying names no one had typed. Surveillance cameras filmed empty streets where figures in long coats walked alone, their shadows lagging behind them. The age of plague had ended. The age of inheritance had begun. For centuries, the Custodes Umbrae sought to master fear, to dissect it, bottle it, weaponize it. They never realized what they were truly creating, a mirror. And now humanity stands before it, seeing not a mask, but itself.
We have become the keepers, the watchers, the doctors of our own contagion. Every algorithm we feed, every pattern we predict, every pulse we measure, each is another whisper into the same dark archive. The plague no longer spreads through rats or breath or blood. It spreads through knowing, through curiosity, through you listening now. Because every time a story like this is told, something stirs. The data flickers, the memory breathes again, and the crows return to circle above. In the end, the mask is not warning us, it is welcoming us home. We wear what they fear, so they may fear what we wear. And now, dear seeker, the circle closes. The plague is not a disease, it is remembrance. And remembrance never dies. They said every story ends, but this one doesn't. It only exhales. You've walked through centuries of masks and memory, through Florence's burning streets, through the blackened halls of Vienna, through the whispering hospitals of London, and into the digital heart of our own age. You've seen doctors who became priests, priests who became engineers, and engineers who became gods. And what did they all seek? The same thing we still do. To cure fear, to make the darkness obey, to master the wound instead of learning to bleed. But fear cannot be cured. It can only be inherited. Every needle, every algorithm, every prayer and prophecy, they were never about erasing death. They were about understanding it. The plague doctors did not worship decay. They worshipped memory, because memory, like disease, spreads from one body to another, through words, through blood, through time. And now it has reached us. We wear masks of plastic and glass instead of leather and beak. We record every heartbeat, every breath, every trembling pulse. We call it data. We call it progress. But behind the glow of every screen, something ancient is watching, a reflection too patient to vanish. The Custodes Umbrae are gone, yet their work endures in every hospital, every laboratory, every equation that pretends to protect us from ourselves. We are their children, their continuation, their confession. The plague was never their punishment, it was their teacher. And so we inherit their vow. To understand the body is to open the soul. To heal is to remember. Listen closely now. In the quiet between the words, in the breath between your heartbeats, you can still hear them. The rustle of robes, the whisper of feathers, the soft exhale of the beak. They are not haunting us. They are waiting. Waiting for the next doctor who believes he can stop death. Waiting for the next machine that promises to save us from ourselves. Waiting for the next plague, born not of flesh, but of faith in control. Because the plague never truly ends. It changes form. It learns our language. It becomes our reflection. And when the mirror finally looks back, when the crows descend again over our shining cities, when the glass fogs and the silence begins to hum, we will remember. We always do.